Καλησπέρα. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που είστε όλοι εδώ. Θα παρακαλούσαμε την Υπουργό Παιδείας και Θρησκευμάτων, κυρία Νίκη Κεραμέως, να απευθύνει χαιρετισμό.
Αξιότιμοι κύριοι βουλευτές και κυρία Ευρωβουλευτή, σεβασμιότατε, αξιότιμοι κύριοι πρέσβεις, αξιότιμοι κύριοι Γενικέ, κύριοι Πρόεδροι, κύριε Δήμαρχε, αξιότιμα μέλη των εθνικών αντιπροσωπιών του ΙΡΑ, αγαπητές και αγαπητοί μας εκπαιδευτικοί, αγαπητοί μας μαθητές, αγαπητά μας παιδιά, κυρίες και κύριοι. Το Διεθνές Συνέδριο πραγματοποιείται από τη Γενική Γραμματεία Θρησκευμάτων και τη Μητρόπολη Μεσσηνίας με τη στήριξη της Πρεσβείας των ΗΠΑ στην Ελλάδα και του Ιδρύματος Fulbright, είναι πιο επίκαιρο από ποτέ. Η ρωσική επίθεση στην Ουκρανία ξυπνά μνήμες από τις πιο σκοτεινές σελίδες της ευρωπαϊκής μας ιστορίας. Η Ευρώπη βρίσκεται αντιμέτωπη με την αναβίωση ενόπλων σειράξεων που τόσο την έχουν στιγματίσει. Σήμερα, περισσότερο από κάθε άλλη φορά, το να θυμόμαστε το παρελθόν για να προφυλάξουμε το μέλλον αποτελεί μια πράξη ευθύνης από όλους μας. Ένα καθήκον απέναντι σε έναν κόσμο που δοκιμάζεται από αναθεωρητισμούς, κατάφορες παραβιάσεις του διεθνούς δικαίου και κάθε έννοιας ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων. Η γνώση και η μνήμη είναι τα κληροδοτήματά μας στη νέα γενιά, προκειμένου να ζήσει απαλλαγμένη από γενοκτονίες, θηριωδίες όπως το Ολοκαύτωμα, πολέμους και μάχες που δεν έχουν νικητές, μόνο μεγάλους χαμένους. Μόνο σημαντικές απώλειες για την ανθρωπότητα και τον πολιτισμό μας. Ως κυβέρνηση και ειδικότερα ως Υπουργείο Παιδείας και Θρησκευμάτων, αναγνωρίζουμε τη σημασία της εκπαίδευσης, την υπογραμμίζουμε για τις γενοκτονίες. Προωθούμε τη διδασκαλία της θηριωδίας του ναζισμού από πολύ νωρίς στα παιδιά μας. Πραγματοποιούμε επιμορφωτικά σεμινάρια σε εκπαιδευτικούς για τη διδασκαλία του Ολοκαυτώματος. Συνεργαζόμαστε με αρμόδιους φορείς. Αναλάβαμε σειρά δράσεων ευαισθητοποίησης στο πλαίσιο της Ελληνικής Προεδρίας, της Διεθνούς Συμμαχίας για τη μνήμη του Ολοκαυτώματος. Περαιτέρω, μέσα από την καλλιέργεια αξιών, όπως ο αλληλοσεβασμός, η αποδοχή της διαφορετικότητας, τα ιδανικά του δημοκρατικού πολιτεύματος και της ενεργού πολιτιότητας από μικρή ηλικία, διασφαλίζουμε ότι δεν θα μείνει ποτέ ξανά καμία χαραμάδα ανοιχτή που θα επιτρέψει οποιαδήποτε αναβίωση φασισμού, αντισημιτισμού, μυσαλλαδοξίας. Θα ήθελα να συγχαρώ θερμά τον σεβασμιότατο Μητροπολίτη Μεσσηνίας, τον κύριο Γενικό Γραμματέα Θρησκευμάτων, τον κύριο Καλατζή, τον Αμερικανό Πρέσβη, τον κύριο Jeffrey Pyatt και το Ίδρυμα Fulbright, καθώς και όλους όσοι συνετέλεσαν στην πραγματοποίηση αυτού του συνεδρίου. Ένα μεγάλο μπράβο και στα παιδιά μας που συμμετείχαν και διακρίθηκαν στο μαθητικό διαγωνισμό το Ολοκαύτωμα και οι Έλληνες Εβραίοι, που καταφέρνουν να καταδικάσουν τη χειρότερη ανθρώπινη πλευρά μέσα από την τέχνη και τη δημιουργία. Εύχομαι κάθε επιτυχία στο συνέδριο και αναμένω με πολύ ενδιαφέρον τα συμπεράσματά του. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Θα παρακαλούσαμε το σεβασμιότατο Μητροπολίτη Μεσσηνίας, κύριο Χρυσόστομο, να ανέβει στο βήμα για ένα χαιρετισμό.
Κυρία Υπουργέ, εξοχότατη κύριε Πρέσβης, κύριε Γενική Γραμματέα Θρησκευμάτων, κύριοι Δήμαρχοι, κύριε Αντιπεριφερειάρχα, εκλεκτό ακροατήριο. Αποτελεί ιδιαίτερη τιμή για την πόλη μας, τοπική κοινωνία και την Εκκλησία η πραγματοποίηση του παρόντος Διεθνούς Συνεδρίου με θέμα Ολοκαύτωμα, Γενοκτονίες και Μαζικές Θηριωδίες. Θυμόμαστε το παρελθόν για να προφυλάξουμε το μέλλον, το οποίο διοργανώνεται από τη Γενική Γραμματεία Θρησκευμάτων του Υπουργείου Παιδείας με την υποστήριξη της Πρεσβείας της Αμερικής στην Ελλάδα, της Ελληνικής Προεδρίας της Διεθνούς Συμμαχίας Μνήμης του Ολοκαυτώματος και την Ιερά Μητρόπολη Μεσσηνίας. Η παρούσα διοργάνωση αποτελεί μια απάντηση σε όλους εκείνους οι οποίοι με τη ρητορική του μίσους, του ρατσισμού, των διακρίσεων, του αντισημιτισμού, της άρνησης και της διαστρέβλωσης του Ολοκαυτώματος προσπαθούν να αμαυρώσουν και να αλλοιώσουν το ανθρωπιστικό πρόσωπο της κοινωνίας και να προβάλλουν άλλα πρότυπα ζωής και συνύπαρξης λαών, εθνών και πολιτισμών. Η πρώτη και κατεξοχήν αφοπλιστική πράξη αποδυνάμωσης της ανιστόρητης αυτής αντίληψης, ότι δηλαδή το Ολοκαύτωμα δεν συνέβη ποτέ, θεωρείται ορθά ότι αποτελεί η προβολή του Ολοκαυτώματος και η προσέγγιση του μέσα από την παιδεία και την εκπαίδευση. Τρόποι με τους οποίους δεν εκφράζεται μόνο η μηδενική ανοχή απέναντι σε κάθε μορφή διαστρέβλωσης και παραχάραξης του Ολοκαυτώματος και των γενοκτονιών, αλλά επιτυγχάνεται και η ευαισθητοποίηση έναντι οποιασδήποτε άλλης πρωτοβουλίας αμφισβήτησης, παραποίησης ή ελαχιστοποίησης της ιστορίας και των μηνυμάτων του Ολοκαυτώματος. Γι' αυτό το λόγο και στο παρόν συνέδριο ετέθη από την Ελληνική Προεδρία ως θεματολογία ο ρόλος και ο σκοπός της παιδείας για την προβολή του Ολοκαυτώματος, αφού κάθε μορφή Ολοκαυτώματος θα πρέπει να καταστεί θέμα προτεραιότητος για κάθε θρησκεία, εκκλησία, ανθρώπινη κοινωνία και εκπαιδευτική κοινότητα. Μία υγιής θρησκευτικότητα, δηλαδή μία υγιής έκφραση του θρησκευτικού συναισθήματος, δεν μπορεί να καλλιεργεί τον θάνατο, τον πόλεμο και την καταστροφή εν ονόματι μιας θρησκείας. Καμιά θρησκεία δεν μπορεί να είναι μυσαλλόδοξη και ρατσιστική, να σκορπά την καταστροφή και να επενδύει στο θάνατο του ανθρώπου και στον πόλεμο των λαών και των εθνών. Οι θρησκείες πρέπει να διαλέγονται και μέσα από το διάλογο να διαμορφώνουν ένα πλαίσιο ειρηνικής συνύπαρξης, συμβίωσης, καταλλαγής, συνεργασίας και σεβασμού της θρησκευτικής ελευθερίας. Αντιλήψεις περί ιερού πολέμου ή εθνοκάρθασης αποτελούν αρνητικές εκφράσεις χρήσης θρησκευτικών συμβόλων μιας μη υγιούς θρησκευτικότητος, δηλαδή έκφραση μιας αλωτριωμένης αντίληψης περί θρησκείας, η οποία κινείται στο χώρο της προπαγάνδας και της ιδεολογίας. Η άποψη ότι ο άνθρωπος για τον άνθρωπο είναι λύκος δεν πρέπει και δεν μπορεί να αποτελεί πρότυπο ανθρώπινης κοινωνίας και συνύπαρξης. Πρέπει να πάψει ο κάθε άνθρωπος να βλέπει τον συνάνθρωπό του ως ξένο και εχθρό και στον εσωτερικό του κόσμο να καλλιεργεί το μίσος και το κακό για τους άλλους. Με τις σκέψεις αυτές σας καλωσορίζω όλους, και τους ομιλητές και τους συμμετέχοντες στο παρόν Διεθνές Συνέδριο. Ευχαριστώ τους διοργανωτές για τη συνεργασία και τη συναντήληψη σε αυτή την προσπάθεια, ως επίσης και τους τοπικούς άρχοντες, και εύχομαι καλή επιτυχία και επίτευξη των επιδιωκομένων σκοπών του συνεδρίου. Σας ευχαριστώ.
Παρακαλούμε τον πρέσβη του Ισραήλ στην Ελλάδα, κύριο Γιώση Αμράνη, να έρθει στο βήμα για ένα σύντομο χαιρετισμό.
Not long ago, on January 27th, together with many all over the world, we marked International Holocaust Remembrance Day. In many cities in Greece, Yanina, Saloniki, Larissa, Volos, to name just a few, Jewish communities, together with local authorities, gathered to mark the day. Last week in Kavala and Xanthi, through an exhibition and the unveiling of a monument. Another step in the commemoration effort was taken. Today, here in Kalamata, as the Greek Presidency of IHRA, affected among other reasons by the pandemic, comes to an end, we are here hopefully to learn from the past and to safeguard the future. The thoughts I wish to share today concern learning, remembering, and responsibility. They are the essential pillars to safeguard the future, to learn from the past, and ensure that humanity, our civilization, is better than it was, maybe better than it is, especially these days. This is IHRA's mission. This is the idea behind its inception. Countries wishing to lead IHRA, be part of it, we welcome North Macedonia, which joined during Greece's presidency, should remember it. As Greece was about to take over, we shared some ideas aimed at making a difference. We should continue our cooperation in the time to come. Our mission and work is not limited in time, and it's not done yet. On learning, it is the Jewish thinker Ahad Ha'am, Asher Ginsberg, who more than 100 years ago, in his essay about the birth of Jewish nationalism, wrote that without the past, without learning and knowing the past, there can be no identity, personal or collective. There can be no future. The Holocaust, an eternal tragedy of the Jewish people, an indelible scar on humanity, histories, and conscience, should be a reflection in the mirror of our collective gaze, raising questions such as how was it possible? How come so many cooperated? How come many turned a blind eye? How come what is defined as the international community, proved to be powerless or indifferent in standing against evil and did not put an end to it? There are many more questions, asked or whispered. Few ask themselves how would they react if and when faced with such an existential dilemma. The importance of learning is knowing to ask the necessary questions, as if we lived then on this soil of Europe. Then and now. On remembrance, in the past hour of our Haggadah, the Pesach Haggadah, there is the thoughtful sentence saying, at each generation one should tell. Yes, at each generation one should tell the story, to remind, to remember. It's a moral, educational challenge to tell the story, to keep researching and studying, to preempt and prevent forgetfulness. Yad Vashem, whose chairman will participate later on today, is committed to remembrance. The State of Israel, born only a few years after the end of World War II, is committed to remembrance, and we do remember. Generations have passed. That past may be distant to some, but the memory, the lesson, is imprinted in us. In his most powerful novel, Shoah Shelanu, Our Holocaust, Israeli novelist and author Amir Gutfreund discusses living with the Holocaust in the life of the second generation growing up in Israel. Born to a family which has not experienced the Holocaust personally or physically, growing up in Israel in the 60s, I can feel and identify and share the experience of discovering and learning about the horrific tragedy. It did happen. The survivors with numbers on their arms, the agony on people's faces, the silence, nothing worse than silence. This part of remembrance, and this is remembrance. This is the proof against denial and the rewriting of history. As so many questions are left unanswered, the one which occupies me the most is how was it possible? How could humanity go bankrupt and reach such a nadir? Maybe a journey into José Samarago literature, especially the novel on blindness of the Portuguese Nobel Literature laureate, can give us an insight into human weaknesses, failures, and shortcomings. I must admit, literature, German literature from that period included, especially the beautiful novels of Hans Falleda, revealed to me an uneasy explanation, the fall of a known order, the collapse of values, political polemics, and the easy use of fear, hate, to achieve political goals. This literature gives us a glimpse into the social background, maybe political too, but not necessarily the ideology which is behind it. No one learning history should underestimate or ignore the role of ideology, as extreme as it may be. We need to learn about the past, to understand human nature, as Professor Yuda Bauer is teaching us, the bestial nature, to understand how this extermination machine could have happened and to ensure it never happens again. The last thought at the start of this conference is about responsibility, how we transform the importance of learning, remembrance, into an action plan. If I may, making the world better, safer. We vow never again. We hear it so often. This is a powerful vow. How are we going to make it true? Do we make it true? Have we seen an end to persecution and discrimination? Have we uprooted prejudice and hate? For me, patriot of my homeland, my identity as an Israeli, my Jewish heritage as embodied in the character of the State of Israel, provide the necessary guarantee we will never again be targeted or victimized. Ensuring Jewish life, the State of Israel, the diaspora, is a stated commitment. It's a way of life. Our responsibility doesn't only end with us. The lesson I draw is to care for the foreigner, the Gentile, the neighbor, our civilization. I congratulate the organizers by expanding the agenda to include the suffering of others. But there should be no doubt, no misunderstanding. the Holocaust is and will remain an historic event not comparable to anything else, while responsibility is beyond our immediate tent. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Θα παρακαλούσαμε τον πρέσβη των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών στην Ελλάδα, κύριο Τζέφρι Πάιατ, ο οποίος είναι συνδεδεμένος διαδικτυακά, να πάρει το λόγο.
Ευχαριστώ. Καλησπέρα σας, everybody. It's a great honor for me to join you today, and let me start by saying how deeply sorry I am that events in Ukraine and our work with our Greek allies prevent me from being with you there in person in Kalamata to engage on these important issues on a beautiful spring day in the Peloponnese. I also want to start by thanking Minister Kerameus and His Eminence, the Metropolitan of Messinia, for working so closely with our team at the embassy in Athens to organize this event. Certainly, there could not be a more timely moment to have this conversation. As Ambassador Amrani reminded us just last weekend, Minister Kerameus was in Xanthi for the unveiling of the new Holocaust memorial there. And I just want to say how fantastic it was to see the minister and other Greek officials, the representative from the local mufti and church leaders, together with the Jewish community to celebrate this important day. Obviously, Northern Greece is a very important region for the U.S. mission, and we are regularly engaged there, including through our presence at the American space, what we call our Xanthi Tech Lab. So, Minister, I really want to applaud your efforts to stand against anti-Semitism and intolerance and to highlight the shared values that connect all of us. Another reason why this event is so timely is, of course, what we're all seeing unfold a few hundred kilometers to the north in Ukraine. Early yesterday, we all saw the grotesque spectacle of Vladimir Putin justifying his bloody invasion of Ukraine by misappropriating history and claiming falsely that democratic Ukraine somehow needs to be denazified. As someone who lived in Kyiv during the Revolution of Dignity and worked closely with Rabbi Bleich and other leaders of that country's Jewish community to understand Ukraine's traumatic Holocaust history, I found President Putin's assertion both painful and offensive to the millions of Ukrainians who perished in the Second World War. I also want to welcome today there in Kalamata Ellen Germain, who's the State Department's Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues, who made the trip from Washington, D.C., particularly for this conference. Of course, I also want to thank Mark Weitzman, the Chief Operating Officer of the World Jewish Restitution Organization, and Dr. Laura Cohen, the Executive Director, the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center of the Queensborough Community College. They both worked closely with our embassy to be here in Kalamata today and share their expertise with us. I'm also very proud that we have so many other U.S. speakers in attendance today, experts joining virtually from the United States, including my U.S. government colleagues from the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Washington, D.C. Of course, I also want to recognize my colleague, Ambassador Amrani, George Poliourakis, the chairman of IHRA, and my dear friend David Harris, the CEO of the American Jewish Committee, for being here, along with Greece's member of the European Parliament, Anna Michalis Kumapoulou, for all of their participation today. Thank you also to my other friends I see on the screen, Janet, David Saltiel, Makis, thank you all for joining this event. We're truly honored by your presence. I want to say also how proud all of us at the U.S. Embassy are of the enormous efforts that Greece has made over the past couple of years to expand knowledge of the Holocaust and educate the public, both about the Holocaust in general, but also its unique impact in Greece. I'm very happy to see the progress that's being made, for instance, on the Holocaust Museum in Thessaloniki. We very much hope that that museum will help not only to share the story of Thessaloniki's vital Jewish community, but also to bring to light the reign of terror that this community suffered under Nazi occupation and the almost 60,000 lives that were lost. 2021 was an important year. Of course, we celebrated the Greek bicentennial, but it was also the year of the Greek presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Over this year, Greece has helped lead the efforts of 34 nations, including the United States, seeking to combat Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism around the world. I really want to commend the Greek government again and publicly for its IHRA presidency, including in particular Deputy Prime Minister Pikoumenos, Foreign Minister Dendias, Ambassador Chris Lazaris, who led the Greek government's efforts on this front until just recently, when he took on the even more challenging job of ambassador to Ankara, and also George Polidorakos, who took the reins after Ambassador Lazaris moved on. As part of this year-long IHRA effort, our embassy worked closely with Minister Karameas and many others in the education ministry to make this conference today a reality. We're very proud of the results, bringing together government leaders, scholars, researchers, historians, and students to share experiences and perspectives. The Holocaust stands as a horrific illustration of where unchecked hatred and intolerance can lead. One of the most shocking examples in history of humanity's capacity to inflict needless cruelty. But history also shows that if we all work together, we can build a better future. And that's why we're here today. We need to systematically counter Holocaust distortion and efforts to deny the Holocaust. We need to stand together to combat anti-Semitism and to educate present and future generations. These are key policy priorities for President Biden and the entire US government, including my boss, Secretary Blinken, who himself is the stepson of a Holocaust survivor and a vocal advocate for the issues of memory and learning Ambassador Amrani described. Under President Biden and Secretary Blinken's leadership, the United States has been taking important steps on this front as well. Just last month, we co-sponsored a UN resolution that charged the international community with combating Holocaust denial through education. In October, Secretary Blinken announced the inauguration of a series of leadership exchange programs that will help us to further advance our shared goals of countering Holocaust distortion and denial. Of course, we're very proud of our work here in Greece to advance religious freedom and showcase how the United States and Greece stand united against hatred and intolerance. So another reason why I'm so proud of the agreement that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial has signed with the Greek government to enable researchers to examine records of Nazi crimes in Greece from 1940 to 1945. And this year, the U.S. Embassy is partnering with the Jewish Museum of Greece to support a special program on women and the Holocaust. This is a program that will highlight the real stories of 5 women Holocaust survivors and provide workshops and resources to educators and school children throughout Greece. It's up to us to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive and to stand together against voices of hatred and intolerance that seek to undermine our democracies. With that in mind, I'd like to close with a quote from Secretary of State Blinken, who said that we remember that evil on a grand scale can and does happen, and we have a responsibility to do everything that we can to stop it. Thank you very much. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Ο κύριος David Harris, CEO της American Jewish Committee, είναι μαζί μας για να απευθύνει ένα σύντομο χαιρετισμό διαδικτυακά. Μπορεί να... Ακούμε.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, many dear friends, including you, Anna, you, Yossi, you, Jeff, you, Danny, the leaders of the Jewish community of Greece. It's a great honor for me to be here, and it's a very personal moment for me as well. I am the son of two Holocaust survivors. My mother was in occupied France in hiding as the Nazis and their French Vichy collaborators looked for every Jew. My father fled Austria, found haven in France, again until France fell, together with the French Vichy, searched for the Jews. So I thank the organizers in Greece. I thank Greece for its year-long leadership of IHRA. And I would like to speak about several lessons that I believe need to be grappled with. We talk about memory, we must. We talk about education, we must. But let's be honest with ourselves. First, time is working against us. The survivors are largely gone. There are few left. We live in a largely ahistorical society. The liberators, the eyewitnesses are also largely gone. How do we sustain memory at a time when the events of the Second World War and the Shoah increasingly recede? How do we ignite imagination to help people understand what actually happened? And not just through numbers, but through names and stories and experiences. But even with all the tools of education and memorialization and museums, and thank goodness for each of them, we cannot bring the 6 million Jews back, neither those of Thessaloniki nor those of elsewhere in Europe. But what can we do beyond shed a tear, recall the past, and then move on? Well, number one, we have to confront current anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is on the rise globally. It's on the rise in the United States. And if one really wants to honor the memory of the 6 million, protect living Jews, even as we honor the memory of dead Jews, including, it should be noted, 1.5 million Jewish children who were never given the chance to grow up. Fight anti-Semitism in all of its forms. Mobilize governments and civil societies. Mobilize religious communities. Mobilize people of goodwill to stand with the Jewish community and defend living Jews and prove that the lessons of the Shoah have been learned. Second, understand the meaning of Israel in today's world for the Jewish people and for the preservation of memory. There was no Israel in 1938 when Hitler teased the world and said, if you want the Jews, if you love them so much, take them. And the world gathered, 32 nations gathered in Evian, France, to discuss the refugee problem. And they did absolutely nothing other than talk, but they would not open their doors. And I'm sad to say that even my own beloved United States brought shame upon itself with its refugee policy at the time. Israel, had it existed in 1938, had it had embassies and consulates across Europe, would have been the exception, the one country that would have welcomed the Jews. And fast forward to today, there's nearly 300,000 Jews in Ukraine. People you know, Jeff, from your own experience as ambassador. Know that if, heaven forbid, they should be driven from their homes, should be at risk together with others in Ukraine, there will be no other Evian conference. There is in Israel. It exists and it's prepared to welcome the Jews of the world. So to fight anti-Semitism, to honor the memory of the Holocaust, for me, and I hope for all of us, is to understand the unique place of Israel, the one and only Jewish majority nation on earth, in the life and the minds of the Jewish people. Third, we need to remember that from 1919 until 1933, Germany was not only arguably the most educated, quote, cultured and industrialized country in the world, it was also a democracy. A chaotic democracy, yes, but a democracy nonetheless. Yet, by January the 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became chancellor of that nation. And within less than 2 months, thanks to enabling legislation from the German parliament, he was given absolute power. It reveals the fragility of a democracy and the fact that in each generation, in every democratic society, including the birthplace of democracy, Greece, and our own country, the United States, we have to fight to defend democracy, true democratic values. And fourth and finally, we have to protect memory, which is under constant assault. Jeff Pyatt said a few moments ago that Vladimir Putin spoke about the denazification of Ukraine. That is an appropriation of history, a distortion of language, trivialization, which cannot go unanswered. And ironically, the Ukraine he speaks about is led today by a proud Jew, President Zelensky, who was elected by the voters of Ukraine. No, it is not Ukraine that needs to be denazified. Let's be clear. Vladimir Putin has taken a playbook from Nazi Germany, 1938-39. Let's begin with denazification in Moscow. And since this conference speaks about both anti-Semitism as well as genocide and mass atrocities, take note of what the Russian mission to the UN said as recently as this week. And I quote, "The goal of the special operation is protection of people in Ukraine who have been victimized and exposed to genocide by the Kiev regime. Our challenge is to fight against the trivialization and the misuse of language. If what is happening today can be depicted as a genocide by Ukraine triggering a Russian invasion, then we all need to be on guard. We need to be on guard when it's used in politics, when it's used in the United Nations, when it's used in social media, when it's used elsewhere. So if we can truly learn these lessons, then I would argue that our efforts have been successful. Otherwise, it will be another knotted memory with life to go on, anti-Semitism to increase, Israel to face existential threats, including the one nation, Jeff, that did not support that resolution at the UN that you spoke about, Iran. That would be the best outcome of this conference and similar conferences, for which, again, I thank the organizers. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Θα παρακαλούσα τον κύριο Γιώργο Πολυδωράκη, πρόεδρο του IHRA, να έρθει στο βήμα.
Κυρία Υπουργέ, κύριε Περιφερειάρχα, κύριε Δήμαρχε, Σεβασμιότατε, κύριε Γενική Γραμματέα Θρησκευμάτων, κυρίες και κύριοι πρέσβεις και μέλη του Διπλωματικού και Προξενικού Σώματος, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι στον IHRA, κύριε Πρόεδρε του Κεντρικού Ιδρυτικού Συμβουλίου, κυρίες και κύριοι, ως Πρόεδρος της Διεθνούς Συμμαχίας για τη Μνήμη του Ολοκαυτώματος, του IHRA, αισθάνομαι μεγάλη χαρά που η Ελληνική Προεδρία της Συμμαχίας ολοκληρώνεται με το ιδιαίτερο σημαντικό αυτό συνέδριο που διοργανώνει εδώ στην όμορφη πόλη της Καλαμάτας η Γενική Γραμματεία Θρησκευμάτων του Υπουργείου Παιδείας και η Ιερά Μητρόπολη Μεσσηνίας. Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω όσο πιο θερμά μπορώ τον Γενικό Γραμματέα Θρησκευμάτων, κ. Γιώργο Καλαντζή, όχι μόνο για τη διοργάνωση του συνεδρίου, αλλά με την ευκαιρία και για την άψογη συνεργασία που είχαμε καθ' όλη τη διάρκεια του ενός σχεδόν έτους που διήρκησε η Προεδρία μας και τη σημαντικότατη συνεισφορά του στην επιτυχία της. Δεν θα ήταν υπερβολή να πω ότι χωρίς τη δική του βοήθεια, όπως και εκείνη της Διευθύντριας του Γραφείου της κ. Βασιλικής Κεραμίδα, η οποία αποτελεί και πολύτιμο μέλος της Ελληνικής Αντιπροσωπείας στον IHRA, και την οποία επίσης ευχαριστώ από καρδίας, η επιτυχία της Προεδρίας μας θα ήταν πολύ μικρότερη. Ευχαριστώ επίσης θερμά τον Σεβασμιότατο Μητροπολίτη Μεσσηνίας κ. Χρυσόστομο μέλος και εκείνος της ελληνικής αντιπροσωπείας στη Συμμαχία, για όλη τη συνεισφορά του και στη διοργάνωση του παρόντος συνεδρίου. Τέλος, ευχαριστώ πολύ την Πρεσβεία των ΗΠΑ στην Αθήνα και το Ίδρυμα Fulbright για τη συμβολή τους στη διοργάνωση του συνεδρίου, όπως και την Πρεσβεία του Ισραήλ για την υποστήριξη που παρήχε σε αυτό. Κυρίες και κύριοι, όπως οι περισσότεροι γνωρίζετε, ο IHRA αποτελεί μια διεθνή συμμαχία με 35 κράτη-μέλη και 9 κράτη-παρατηρητές, με 3 βασικά πεδία δραστηριοποίησης όσον αφορά τη μνήμη του Ολοκαυτώματος. Την εκπαίδευση γύρω από το Ολοκαύτωμα, την ακαδημαϊκή έρευνα και τη διαφύλαξη των σχετικών μνημείων και μουσείων. Η δραστηριότητα όμως του IHRA δεν περιορίζεται μόνο σε αυτούς τους 3 τομείς. Μεταξύ άλλων, ιδίως κατά τα τελευταία χρόνια, ο IHRA προσπαθεί να μελετήσει τη σχέση μεταξύ του Ολοκαυτώματος ως ακραία μορφή γενοκτονίας και των άλλων γενοκτονιών. Βασικός λόγος είναι ότι η μελέτη και άλλων γενοκτονιών, συγκριτικά με το Ολοκαύτωμα, το οποίο έχει μελετηθεί περισσότερο από όλες τις υπόλοιπες γενοκτονίες και συχνά θεωρείται ότι έδωσε το έναυσμα για τη διαμόρφωση και τις ίδιες τις έννοιες του όρου γενοκτονία, μπορεί να βοηθήσει στη χάραξη ιστορικά τεκμηριωμένης πολιτικής, την αντιμετώπιση και την πρόληψη γενοκτονιών και εγκλημάτων μαζικής θηριωδίας. Η συγκεκριμένη άποψη διατυπώνεται άλλωστε και στην Υπουργική Διακήρυξη που εξέδωσαν τα κράτη-μέλη του IHRA το 2020, η οποία υιοθετήθηκε με αφορμή τα 75 χρόνια από την απελευθέρωση των ναζιστικών στρατοπέδων συγκέντρωσης και τα 20 χρόνια από τη διακήρυξη της Στοκχόλμης του 2000, θεωρείται το ιδρυτικό κείμενο της Συμμαχίας. Είναι προφανές ότι οι διαφορές μεταξύ του Ολοκαυτώματος και των υπολείπων γενοκτονιών είναι πολύ σημαντικές. Η συγκριτική μελέτη, κατά την οποία οι διαφορές και οι ομοιότητες αναφέρονται χωρίς να μειώνεται καθόλου το βάρος και η σημασία του Ολοκαυτώματος, είναι εκείνη όμως που μπορεί να δημιουργήσει ένα μοντέλο κατανόησης των συνθηκών, των παραγόντων και των αιτιών που οδήγησαν στις γενοκτονίες και άρα να βοηθήσει στη διαμόρφωση της κατάλληλης πολιτικής για την αποτροπή τους. Η δραστηριοποίηση του IHRA σε αυτόν τον τομέα έχει αναλάβει κυρίως η Επιτροπή της Συμμαχίας για το Ολοκαύτωμα, τις Γενοκτονίες και τα εγκλήματα κατά της ανθρωπότητας. Και είναι τιμή μας που στο συνέδριο της Καλαμάτας παρευρίσκεται και συμμετέχει και επικεφαλής της συγκεκριμένης επιτροπής για την τρέχουσα περίοδο, κ. Μπρούνο Μπουαγέ, μέλος της Γαλλικής Αντιπροσωπείας των IHRA και διευθυντής διεθνών σχέσεων του Ιδρύματος Memorial de la Shoah. Στο πλαίσιο των δραστηριοτήτων της Επιτροπής αυτής, κατά τον περασμένο χρόνο, για παράδειγμα, μεταξύ άλλων συζητήθηκαν η γενοκτονία των Χερέρο και των Άμα, η γενοκτονία των Αρμενίων και η γενοκτονία των Ελλήνων του Πόντου και της Μικράς Ασίας. Ορισμένα από τα θέματα αυτά θα συζητηθούν και στο συνέδριο που ξεκινά σήμερα. Στο πλαίσιο άλλωστε της συγκριτικής μελέτης του Ολοκαυτώματος και των άλλων γενοκτονιών διοργανώνεται αυτό. Καθώς αυτή είναι η τελευταία μεγάλη εκδήλωση υπό την αιγίδα και κατά τη διάρκεια της Ελληνικής Προεδρίας, νομίζω ότι επιβάλλεται και ελπίζω να μου το επιτρέψετε να προβώ σε έναν πολύ σύντομο απολογισμό του έργου μας κατά τους 11 τελευταίους μήνες. Η Ελληνική Προεδρία, παρά τις αντιξοότητες, κατάφερε να επιτύχει τους βασικούς της στόχους. Δεν καταφέραμε δυστυχώς να υποδεχτούμε στην Ελλάδα τις εθνικές αντιπροσωπείες για τις 2 ολομέλειες της Αθήνας και της Θεσσαλονίκης, λόγω της πανδημίας, αλλά οι ψηφιακές ολομέλειες που έλαβαν χώρα ήταν επιτυχημένες. Επιτρέψτε μου να αναφέρω λίγα μόνο από τα επιτεύγματα αυτών των 2 συναντήσεων. Κατά τις 2 ολομέλειες, η Συμμαχία διαβρύνθηκε με ένα νέο κράτος μέλος και 2 νέα κράτη παρατηρητές, ενώ υιοθετήθηκε δήλωση σκληρής καταδίκης της αντισημιτικής βίας και των δηλώσεων μίσους κατά τη διάρκεια της κλιμάκωσης της βίας στη Μέση Ανατολή τον Μάιο του 2021. Επίσης, κατά την Ολομέλεια της Αθήνας, αποφασίστηκε η έκδοση συστάσεων για τη διδασκαλία σχετικά με τη γενοκτονία των Ρωμά. Παράλληλα, καθώς η Προεδρία είχε θέσει ως έναν από τους 2 βασικούς της άξονες την εκπαίδευση σχετικά με το Ολοκαύτωμα, κατά τη διάρκεια του προηγουμένου έτους πραγματοποιήθηκε με τη συνεργασία του Υπουργείου Παιδείας μεγάλος αριθμός σχετικών σεμιναρίων για εκπαιδευτικούς, κληρικούς, στελέχη των σωμάτων ασφαλείας και άλλα στελέχη της δημόσιας διοίκησης. Ενώ, όσον αφορά τον άλλο άξονα της Ελληνικής Προεδρίας, την καταπολέμηση του αντισημιτισμού στο διαδίκτυο, συμμετείχαμε στη διοργάνωση ειδικού συμποσίου για το Ολοκαύτωμα και τη ρητορική μίσους, το οποίο έλαβε χώρα στο πλαίσιο του Athens Democracy Forum τον περασμένο Σεπτέμβριο. Και φυσικά, μετά το τέλος της Προεδρίας, αλλά σε συνέχεια των δράσεων που αναπτύχθηκαν στο πλαίσιό της, θα διοργανωθεί στα Ιωάννινα στα τέλη Μαΐου συνέδριο για τη διαστρέβλωση και την άρνηση του Ολοκαυτώματος στα μέσα κοινωνικής δικτύωσης. Είμαστε πραγματικά ευχαριστημένοι και περήφανοι για τα όσα επιτύχαμε. Κλείνοντας, επιτρέψτε μου να καλωσορίσω και να ευχαριστήσω τους συμμετέχοντες ομιλητές στο συνέδριο που ξεκινά σήμερα, ορισμένοι από τους οποίους ήρθαν από το εξωτερικό. Η συμμετοχή σας μας τιμά πραγματικά. Καθώς, όπως προείπα, οι ολομέλειες της Αθήνας και της Θεσσαλονίκης διενεργήθηκαν διαδικτυακά, ως πρόεδρος του IHRA χαίρομαι επίσης ειλικρινώς που έστω και την τελευταία στιγμή κατορθώνουμε να υποδεχθούμε στην Ελλάδα ορισμένα από τα μέλη των εθνικών αντιπροσωπείων στον IHRA που έχουν έρθει στην Καλαμάτα και είναι εδώ μαζί μας σήμερα για να συμμετέχουν στο συνέδριο είτε ως θεατές είτε ως ομιλητές. Είμαι επίσης ευτυχής που είναι ακόμα σήμερα παρόντες για να παρακολουθήσουν το συνέδριο πολλά μέλη του Διπλωματικού και του Προξενικού Σώματος στην Ελλάδα. Έχουμε καλή επιτυχία στις εργασίες του συνεδρίου και είμαι σίγουρος ότι τα αποτελέσματά του θα καταγραφούν ως ένα πολύ ενδιαφέρον κεφάλαιο της πρόσφατης ιστορίας του IHRA. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Θα παρακαλούσαμε τον Chief Operating Officer του World Jewish Restitution Organization, κύριο Μάρκ Βάιτσμαν, να έρθει στο βήμα για να απευθύνει την κεντρική ομιλία του συνεδρίου.
I'd like to begin by expressing my great thanks to Minister for Education and Religious Affairs Karamias and to His Eminence Metropolitan of Messinia, Chrysostomos, for their sponsorship of this important conference, and also to Vasiliki Karamida, the head of the Cabinet of the Secretary General, for coordinating this event so excellently. My appreciation as well to the Greek Presidency of IHRA, through Ambassador Chris Lazarus and now Georgios Politikarakis, as well as my deepest gratitude to U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, Special Envoy on Holocaust Issues Ellen Germain, and their teams for the year-long support and commitment to making the Greek presidency, IHRA presidency, a successful one, and for all the work they do on these issues throughout the year. I also want to acknowledge the efforts of the past IHRA president, Ambassador Michaela Kuchler of Germany, emphasizing strengthening IHRA's efforts to combat Holocaust distortion. When I accepted the invitation to speak here, I suggested as the title of my talk, Why the Past Matters, the Holocaust and the Struggle Over History in a Fractured World. This was a subject that I've been working on extensively the last 2 decades, and one that I felt was deeply important. And as it turns out, the events of the last few days have demonstrated far beyond anything I can say just how important. Vladimir Putin's aggression, his war, is built upon distortions of history. Indeed, distortions of the very history that we have gathered here to safeguard. I had the opportunity to participate in IHRA from its very beginnings, 1998 in Washington, 2000 in Stockholm, and ever since. And I want to acknowledge the presence of my good friend Hannah Lessing, who has also been a member of IHRA through that period. And we were there in Stockholm when the Stockholm Declaration, written by our good friend and esteemed advisor, Professor Yehuda Bauer, was adopted as the foundational document of IHRA. I want to quote a little bit from that document. Quote, the Holocaust, Shoah, fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust will always hold universal meetings. We must strengthen the moral commitment of our peoples and the political commitment of our governments to ensure that future generations can understand the causes of the Holocaust and reflect upon its consequences. And then updating that commitment, the 2020 IHRA Ministerial Declaration added, again quoting, today the world still faces continued threats to pluralistic, democratic, and inclusive societies. And it adds, to accept our responsibility as governments to continue working together to counter Holocaust denial and distortion, anti-Semitism, and all forms of racism and discrimination that undermine fundamental democratic principles. We meet here in Greece, the cradle of both democracy and history, at exactly the same time that Vladimir Putin has unleashed an act of aggression, a war on both democracy and history. To be precise, Putin has weaponized historical distortion, including the history of the Holocaust as his tool against democracy. As U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said to the UN recently, Russia will, quote, manufacture a pretext for its attack. Putin was not the first to do so. Indeed, he has joined his communist ancestors who shared the Nazis' disdain for history. Like Putin, they both have wielded history as a weapon. His infamous speech of October 4th, 1943, Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the final solution, the head of the SS, emphasized the Nazi commitment to secrecy and denial, stating to his audience of SS men, that the genocide of the Jews was, quote, never mentioned and never to be mentioned, end quote. But this distortion of history was not only rhetorical. The entire mass murder of Europe's Jews was enacted through euphemisms and coded descriptions, such as special treatment, Sonderbehandlung, to describe the murder of Jews, Endlösung, the final solution, which referred to the systematic extermination of the Jews, as well through formal programs like Special Action, Sonderaction 1005, the Nazi program that used slave laborers to exhume mass graves and destroy the corpses of those Jews who had been murdered during the German occupations of Poland and other Eastern European countries. The genocidal anti-Semitism of the Nazis took many forms. The one component was the link between Jews and liberal democracy. As Adolf Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, again quoting, all at once the Jew also becomes liberal and begins to rave about the unnecessary progress of mankind. His ultimate goal in this stage is the victory of democracy, or as he understands it, the rule of parliamentarianism. That was the sin of the Jews. Putin's remark that we will, quoted before, we will strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine is a prime example of his callous approach to history. Those words build upon the themes that he wrote about in his essay on Ukraine last year, when he began by writing, again quoting, to have a better understanding of the present and look into the future, we need to turn to history. And he even accused Ukraine of permitting a new Katyn. Putin is no ideologue. His many teachers, including the mystical neo-Nazi Alexander Dugin, for example, already back in 2014, called for Russian annexation of Ukraine. And that was the same year that Russia passed the so-called Yarovaya law that explicitly banned, literally, the dissemination of knowingly false information on the activities of the USSR during the Second World War. As our IHRA colleague Robert Williams has pointed out, because this law referenced the Nuremberg trial record as the historical basis, as its historical basis, it had the effect of perpetuating any inaccuracies that existed in that record, thus permitting the Russians to continue to blame the Katyn Forest massacre on the Germans, even though Soviet-era archives that were declassified and published in the 1990s proved it to be an NKVD, which was the forerunner of Putin's KGB operation. This law led to the conviction and fining of a blogger who wrote that communism and Nazism closely collaborated in starting World War II, an assessment that is largely correct. The law also led to a number of Russian bookstores to stop selling the award-winning Holocaust graphic novel Mouse because of a swastika that was on its cover, thus aligning them with the ignorant school board in the state of Tennessee in the United States that recently banned the book as well. And even in his appearance at the gathering of world leaders at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, marking the 75th liberation of the Auschwitz death camp in 2020, Putin trampled on history by attempting to redraw the map of Europe to help underwrite his attempt to blame Poland for starting World War II, when it was in fact the Nazi Soviet invasion of Poland that set off the war. In his poignant reaction to Putin earlier this week, Ukrainian President Zelensky pointed out the lack of historical reality in Putin's justifications by saying to the Russian people, quote, you are told that we are Nazis, but how can a people support Nazis that gave more than 8 million lives for the victory over Nazism? How can I be a Nazi? Tell my grandpa, who went through the whole war in the infantry of the Soviet army and died as a colonel in independent Ukraine. But Putin is far from being alone in not letting historical accuracy interfere with his political goals. Even some of the countries threatened by Russia, including Ukraine and Poland, have gone down that path as well. In Ukraine, laws passed in 2015 attempted to shield the OUNB, the Ukrainian nationalist group that collaborated in the Holocaust in the Ukraine and was implicated in the ethnic cleansing of Poles, from research and criticism. While this law could have served as a pretext for Putin's claim Ukrainian neo-Nazism, it has in fact not been acted upon in recent years. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of Poland. Their Holocaust distortion has been embraced at the highest levels. While elements had long been present in certain Polish circles, the last few years have seen literally an explosion of distortion. We can look at the so-called IPN laws that essentially stated that since Poland was occupied by Nazi Germany during the time of the Holocaust, any person who makes a statement that refers to Polish collaboration or complicity in the murder of millions of Jews killed on Polish soil is committing a crime. The law was proposed in 2016 and I took part in an IHRA diplomatic mission to Warsaw that year to convey our deep concern about the proposed legislation, but to no avail. And indeed, in 2018, charges were brought by the Polish government against Princeton professor, former Solidarity activist Jan Gross. These actions resulted in tremendous international criticism, leading the Poles to offer a compromise to limit the prosecution to civil proceedings, thus dropping the criminal aspect. Although some, including the previous Israeli government, sadly welcomed the change, the result stayed the same. While the criminal charges against Gross were dropped, civil proceedings were instituted against two other prominent historians, Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski. They were initially found guilty, won a reversal on appeal, and are waiting to see if further action will be taken against them. While these cases were high profile, they only represent the tip of the iceberg. The IPN, to give it its full name, the Institute of National Remembrance, which is charged with being the official guardian of Poland's history during World War II and the post-war totalitarian period, has recently employed such figures as Arkadiusz Wingert, the former Polish publisher of the notorious British Holocaust denier David Irving, the promoter of neo-Nazi bands Mariusz Bechta, and the former ONR, the fascist National Radical Camp coordinator Patricia Ressel. These are the types who have been entrusted to guard Poland's historical memory of World War II and the Holocaust. Recently, the sponsor of the IPN law, the historian Jan Zarin, was appointed to head a new and very well-funded institute that was created to promote the heritage of Roman Dmowski, the pre-war anti-Semitic ideologue who argued for a total Polish-speaking and Catholic-practicing nation with no room for others, and instigated for boycotts of Jewish businesses, as well as the numerus clausus, which limited the number of Jewish university students. Another well-funded institution that has received millions of dollars from the Polish government is Radio Maria, a notorious anti-Semitic radio station that has been condemned by the Vatican for its anti-Jewish remarks, and in 2008 was called by the State Department's Global Anti-Semitism Report, quote, one of Europe's most blatantly anti-Semitic media ventures. Radio Maria is run by Father Tadeusz Rzyk. His latest venture, also with government support, is the creation of a museum dedicated to inflating the number of Polish rescuers and shifting the narrative of the Holocaust in Poland from the Jewish victims to the Polish rescuer. It is important to be accurate here. Poles did rescue Jews and risked and suffered for their efforts, with some paying the ultimate price, including their families. Poland had the only national government in exile underground organization in Nazi-occupied Europe devoted to saving Jews, namely Żegota, and those efforts need to be recognized, studied, and learned from, and the search should continue for more rescuers, but not as an attempt to distort the historical reality that Engelking, Grabowski, and others have exposed regarding numerous acts of Polish complicity and collaboration in the Holocaust. And it is equally important to note that Poland, as a country, was a victim of the Nazis and the Soviets. And there were no Polish state during World War II, so there cannot be, to use the term, Polish death camps, a statement that IHRA made back in 2017 when it said that the term was historically unsupportable and urged the dropping of usage of that term. But again, Poland is far from the only example. In Hungary, we have the attempts to rehabilitate the reputation of Admiral Miklos Horthy, who, as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum says, was a, quote, vocal anti-Semite and complicit in the murder of the country's Jewish population during the Holocaust. These efforts included the erection of statues that created what came to be known as the Horthy cult recently. Horthy was not the only disreputable figure to have a statue created in his honor. Valentin Toman, the historian and politician who introduced the Hungarian version of the Nuremberg laws, was similarly honored, although in both cases, the wave of international criticism induced the Hungarian government to back away from these plans. And I want to give full credit here to former U.S. Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism, Ira Foreman, who led some of that international charge. One statue that was erected was in honor of the anti-Semitic writer Cecily Torme, although plans to name a street after her were revoked. Other efforts have included the successful move to include Nazi-era fascist and anti-Semitic writers, such as Josef Miro and Albert Voss, into the state curriculum, while dropping Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winning author Imre Kertész. In Lithuania, controversy exists now over the reputation of Jonas Noreika, a national hero for his role in fighting the Soviets and who was murdered by the KGB. But when his granddaughter in America began to write a family history, she discovered, quoting his granddaughter, that he agreed with the Nazis on the elimination of Jews. And not only did he agree in theory, but in practice, he signed documents establishing a Jewish ghetto and seizing Jewish property. But Noreika's defenders, including the government's own historical institute, refused to accept this evidence and instead continued to describe Noreika as being active in the rescue of Jews. To this day, many streets are named after Noreika, and plaques in his honor are prominent. One, a plaque in the National Academy of Sciences in Vilnius, was finally removed this past July by order of the mayor. So, while it might be easy to continue pointing fingers to the nations of Eastern Europe, it is extremely important to note that Holocaust distortion is not limited to that region, but is equally present in the West as well. There are hardcore examples, like the Flemish town that had a statue in honor of Waffen-SS collaborators until it was removed under pressure last year. In Canada, at least 2 cemeteries contain memorials to Ukrainian SS volunteers. And in the US, 2 graves of German POWs bearing Nazi swastikas were just removed from a military cemetery and placed with new headstones last year. Also in the US, there are monuments to notorious Ukrainian-Lithuanian collaborators, among others, as well as plaques and other honors to the Nazi rocket scientists, such as the famous or infamous Wernher von Braun, who came to the US in Operation Paperclip to help build the US space programs. But what we see today is far more pernicious and dangerous are the attempts of political leaders to rewrite history. And those are not limited to Vladimir Putin. Take one example, Marine Le Pen has claimed that France is not responsible for the rounding up of Jews in Paris during World War II, despite French President Jacques Chirac's 1995 apology for just those actions. Le Pen is stealing a page from the Polish playbook, not denying the Holocaust. None of these figures that I've mentioned before have denied that the Holocaust took place, but they are asserting that there was no national responsibility, only German guilt to win over the voters or rehabilitating the reputation of collaborators. It's not limited to the far right either. The comparison of Israel to Nazi Germany is a staple of many extremist anti-Zionist progressives, such as the former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, and the former Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Some extremists even use photoshopped images of Holocaust survivors that are distorted to make them appear to be protesting Israeli policies. In many countries today, particularly in the West, we see a wave of illiberal activists, politicians, and others who made Holocaust distortion a mainstream phenomenon, surfacing particularly in the anti-vaccination movements. The examples are too numerous to cite specifically. I think we're probably all familiar with them. But from Germany and Austria to the UK and the US, we find an overwhelming misuse of the Holocaust to further a political agenda, drawing on all sorts of illegitimate comparisons and inaccurate references, using yellow stars and Holocaust imagery. The distortion of the Holocaust has become part of the political playbook. In the US, we have the repeated comments of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who persists in making inappropriate comparisons between the Holocaust and COVID vaccinations, even after visiting the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Greene is a symbol of a radical US political populism that culminated in the January 6, 2021 insurrection in the Capitol. Like many, I watched these events as they unfolded, and I was transfixed. And then afterwards, I watched different reactions. I was particularly struck by the comments of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The speaker is a veteran politician, not easily moved, not usually emotional in public, and yet her emotions were raw and visible as she spoke, and her words focused on the character storming the Capitol who wore a, quote, Camp Auschwitz t-shirt. In Speaker Pelosi's own words, there were so many disgusting images, but one figure of a man in a shirt with Auschwitz on it, that was what she singled out. Since then, I've often thought about her reaction and wondered why she was focusing on that, with all the characters and things that she could have looked at. And I think she intuitively was focusing on the link between distorting the Holocaust and assaulting the foundations of liberal democracy today. Whereas the historian James Banner has written in his brand new study of historical revisionism, quote, in one of history's many ironies, modern historical revisionism owes many of its strengths to reaction against liberalism. Hardcore Holocaust deniers such as David Irving and their allies, such as the government of Iran, have tried to cover up their denial by using the term revisionism in an attempt to gain legitimacy. Indeed, the very center of Holocaust revisionism denial in the United States called itself the Institute for Historical Revisionism. When it wasn't an institute, just a storefront, when there was no history involved, only the history of the Holocaust essentially, and instead of revising, they were attempting to deny it. But ever since Deborah Lipstadt, who hopefully will soon be confirmed by the Senate to take the position of Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism, ever since she defeated David Irving in the famous 2000 trial, outright Holocaust denial has been regulated to the crackpot fringe. Banner has pointed out that many abuses of the term historical revisionism exist, ranging from the use by a recent U.S. president to crackpot, his words, Holocaust revisionism, which is Holocaust denial under another name. But his point remains that true historical revisionism grew of age in 19th century Germany as a German reaction against the liberalizing ideas of the French Revolution. History has always been a potential political tool. In the words of the late Israeli historian Jacob L. Talmon, nation came to connote a collective historical personality. In other words, nations reflect their own history. Our post-World War II world is no different, except that we might add to nations the international, or at least the Western community. The institutions that have undergirded the stability and principles of this world were in so many ways a product of the revulsion and abhorrence of the results of the Holocaust and World War II. They were created to help ensure that we would never go down that path again. They include international organizations such as the United Nations, the EU, NATO, concepts like war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity and human rights, along with the establishment of war crimes tribunals to hold the guilty responsible. Our esteemed advisor, Professor Bowers, consistently warned us about misuse of the Holocaust, distortion of the Holocaust, again as a political tool. If Holocaust denial is the attempt to erase the record of the murder of approximately 6 million Jews, then Holocaust distortion is the effort to whitewash the attempt itself. It is an endeavor to minimize or deflect the horrors of the Holocaust in order to restore a perspective that is sympathetic to the forces of extreme nationalism, anti-liberalism, and anti-Semitism, among others, and to restore them to political power. In that struggle, IHRA might have a small, but nonetheless very important role to play. As the semi-official guardian of the international community of the memory of the Holocaust, it is in a position to remind, affirm, and strengthen the historical record. Its working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, which I had the honor of helping write and guide to its adoption, with the strong leadership of the then Canadian chair, Mario Silva, in 2013, represents a significant step in these efforts, a step that the German presidency of Ambassador Kuchler vigorously continued with the creation of the Task Force Against Holocaust Distortion. And the growing international adoptions and endorsements of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism also testified to the importance of IHRA's role. And I am extremely proud to have introduced and steered that definition to its adoption as well. To conclude, let us return to our host country, Greece, and add the words of the prominent Jewish historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who wrote, if Herodotus was the father of history, the father of meaning in history were the Jews. In today's world, IHRA and all those who remember the Holocaust, in effect, have joined the Jews in both trying to help collect and maintain the facts of the Holocaust. And while we may recall some attempts to find meaning in the Holocaust, we can and should and need find lessons to be learned from it. This task should not be limited to IHRA. All who recognize the fundamental importance of this history and what we can learn from it need to play a role. The official Western efforts at commemoration that link Europe and the world together on January 27th are an example, but official proclamations fade the day after they are issued, unless they are backed up by serious and practical commitments. The survivors are honored for a day, but many still live in poverty and are denied any chance for restitution that might restore some justice and physical link to the remnants of their lives before the Holocaust. Vladimir Putin has made clear the stakes involved for our world. How we react is the legacy we will leave behind for generations to follow. As the foundational book of the Jewish people, the Torah, points out in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verse 19, the choice is in our hands. We can choose to affirm and protect history, and so we can choose life. To do otherwise is to yield to Putin and the acolytes of a liberal ideology who offer only return to the bad old times. It is my hope that through the efforts of IHRA, all of us who have gathered here, the countries that have made that commitment, we will reject a return to those times and indeed choose life moving forward. Thank you.
Μπορούμε να κάνουμε ένα σύντομο διάλειμμα του 1/4 και να έρθουμε στις 4:04 για να συνεχίσουμε με το πάνελ συζήτησης. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Wait. Hi. Nice to see you.
To be here. Sorry, I'm not there in person.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. This Ukrainian thing really, threw a wrench in everybody's life. Well, less in ours. Hello. Hello, panelists.
Hello.
Nice to see you. They're just, I just called the organizers and they're rounding everybody up in the room. So should be just a few more minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Sure.
Who were we? I can't hear you.
Sorry.
There we go. Spence. Hi,
Is this-
Spence.
Hey, how are you doing? Nice to meet you.
Fine. Nice to meet you too.
Is this panel going to be all on Zoom? Are there going to be live speakers?
No, there's people in the conference room.
Yeah, but I mean, are all the panels?
No, all of us, we're all on Zoom, on WebEx or whatever this is. Yeah,
Okay.
we're all virtual, the five of us. So we're all here, which is great. Thank you very much. Since we haven't started yet, thank you personally for your cooperation. I would have liked for us all to be in wonderful Kalamata, the birthplace of my grandfather. I would like to be there too, but or I'd like to be in DC, or I'd like to be in Israel. But, yeah, I like coming to DC because my son's a freshman at George Washington.
Oh,
So,
wow.
Yeah,
Very nice.
yeah, yeah. So I come as often as whenever I can find an excuse, I come. And I haven't been to Israel in a while, unfortunately, with all this COVID stuff. I came on a wonderful AJC TFI visit, I guess right before COVID. Fantastic. It was really great. So hopefully we'll have health and peace, which we have heretofore taken for granted only too much, I guess. And we will be able to meet again in person. So we're all scripted, so you all know the order of things. And in the end, I'll ask if there's questions from the audience, but if there aren't any questions from the audience, I would propose that we do 2 rounds. And I thought I
Θα ακολουθήσει πάνελ συζήτηση. Η Άννα Μισέλα Σιμακοπούλου, μέλος της Ευρωβουλής και πρόεδρο της Transatlantic Friend of Israel, στο οποίο θα συμμετέχουν ο κύριος Ντάνι Νταγιάν, πρόεδρος του Yad Vashem, ο Ραβίνος Άντριου Μπέικερ από το AJC, η κυρία Τζένιφερ Τζιαρντέλη από το United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum και ο κύριος William Spencer, Executive Director του Institute for International Law and Human Rights. Θα παρακαλούσαμε μόνο, θερμή παράκληση, οι ομιλητές να μιλάνε λίγο πιο αργά, έτσι ώστε να προλαβαίνουμε και την ταυτόχρονη μετάφραση. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Δίνω το λόγο στην κυρία Σιμακοπούλου.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Keramida. Yes, we will speak slowly and clearly for translation purposes. So, Your Eminence, Minister, esteemed policymakers from European Parliament, from the Greek Parliament, from local authorities, dear David Harris, representatives of the Jewish community, representatives of other organizations who are with us today, Your Excellencies, ambassadors of Israel and the United States, esteemed panelists, it is really my pleasure to welcome you today to this international conference in Kalamata on Holocaust, genocides, and mass atrocities, entitled Remembering the Past to Safeguard the Future. My name is Anna Michelle Asimakopoulou. I am a Greek member of the European Parliament, and I'm also the president of the interparliamentary group Transatlantic Friends of Israel. I'm pleased to have been invited to moderate this very important session on future-proofing our policy toolbox against atrocities. So before I introduce our very distinguished panel today, please allow me a brief introduction regarding what members of the European Parliament, lawmakers like myself, and the European Union institutions are doing to future-proof our policy toolbox against atrocities. Last October, the European Commission launched its first ever strategy on combating anti-Semitism, promoting research and education and Holocaust remembrance, as well as Jewish life in Europe. This is a very welcome step by the Commission, and I hope to see it effectively implemented, especially as we've seen over the past few years the brutal murder of Jews across Europe, while the increased use of social media and the pandemic have led to a shocking rise of age-old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. In addition, the Commission is strengthening its legal framework on tackling hate speech and hate crime across the European Union. The European Parliament is quite proactive as a whole, while several groups of members of the European Parliament are particularly active in combating anti-Semitism. A case in point, last November, I participated in a project with other members of the Parliament. This project was called Online Anti-Semitism, the EU Strikes Back. What we did, we tested several social media companies and their ability to remove posts that spread anti-Semitic rhetoric, including links to COVID-19 and Holocaust denial posts. I know you won't be surprised when I tell you that almost all of these platforms fell short of their promises to combat hate speech and anti-Semitism. So what we need to do, and what we're doing in the European Parliament, is reinforcing the rules to hold social media platforms accountable for this type of content. I'm also a member of the Parliament's working group against anti-Semitism, which attempts to take more proactive measures to protect victims of anti-Semitism and to promote legislation where appropriate to ensure that anti-Semitic actions do not become accepted behavior in society and they don't go unpunished. Legislation and other initiatives at the EU level involving liability for online hate speech are now at the front line of future-proofing our legislative toolbox. I need not explain to this audience today how crucial education about the past is for the future. However, the EU cannot tackle these issues alone, which is why I'm very proud to be the president of the Transatlantic Friends of Israel, a group of legislators which seeks to promote close transatlantic ties based on our shared values and our shared priorities. It's a strong relationship between the EU, the US, and Israel is a key part to make our efforts a joint success. Transatlantic Friends of Israel is a growing network of over 160 cross-party lawmakers from 26 countries, united in the conviction that the Jewish state must be understood as an integral part of the Western security, political, and economic architecture. We've conducted a number of successful campaigns, for example, urging the EU in 2020 to ban Hezbollah in its entirety. This campaign was signed by 260 lawmakers, and last year calling on the EU and fellow democracies to help end the systematic discrimination against Israel at the United Nations, signed by 318 lawmakers. Transatlantic Friends of Israel works very hard at combating Israel-related anti-Semitism, such as with the bigoted Amnesty International report, which defamed the Jewish state as a racist state. The IHRA definition lists such attempts to delegitimize Israel as examples of modern anti-Semitism. We've also written letters and helped promote legislation to end the anti-Semitic incitement in Palestinian textbooks. So, when we look to safeguarding the future, we must remember that history has shown that genocides are always pre-announced. This is why we must take such threats seriously. The NGO Genocide Watch emphasized that genocide is a process that develops in 10 key stages, and the 10th stage is denial. So I previously mentioned that the use of social media has seen a deplorable surge and uptake in the spread of Holocaust denial. However, it's not just social media users that spread disinformation and participate in Holocaust denial. UN members do that too. Last month, Iran was alone among the 193 UN members when it disassociated itself from a Holocaust resolution and accused Israel of abusing international mechanism. It's chilling that in this day and age, a UN member can act in this manner. What's worse, Iran calls openly for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state and has been working on nuclear weapons that could threaten Israel's existence. The Iranian authorities are also engaging in horrendous human rights violations at home. Genocide Watch believes that the Iranian regime's widespread discrimination and persecution of Baha'is and Sunnis puts it at stage 7 of what the NGO considers to be a 10-stage genocide process. It even issued a genocide warning alert that Iran is at the stage of preparation. So this is not a time to remain idle. This is also why just last week, the European Parliament, on the initiative of a Transatlantic Friends of Israel vice president, passed a resolution condemning the Iranian regime for its human rights violations, specifically for its mass executions. Ladies and gentlemen, genocides threaten the very fabric of civilization. Remembrance plays a critical role in combating anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and distortion, as well as in preventing future genocides. By remembering the past, we're better able to safeguard the future. So we need to future-proof our policy toolbox, to develop programs to educate future generations and ensure that social media companies take effective measures to combat anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial or distortion. Thank you for allowing me this brief introduction. And I'm really honored. And I would like to thank the esteemed panelists that are with us today, and also the General Secretary of the Ministry of Education and his Chief of Staff, the competent and very patient and hardworking Vasiliki Keramida, who have helped me reach out to today's panelists and organize this, what I expect to be a very high level and interesting discussion. So with us today, we have Danny Dayan, the chairman of the Yad Vashem Directorate, Rabbi Andrew Baker, AJC Director of International Jewish Affairs, Jennifer Ciardelli, Director, Initiative on the Holocaust and Professional Leadership of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and William Spencer, the Executive Director at the Institute for International Law and Human Rights. I'll give the panelists a first round of comments, and then I'm very happy you can either put questions in the chat or we can take questions from the conference room so we can have 1 or 2 rounds of brief replies from our expert participants. Let me say it's a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Yad Vashem Chairman Danny Dayan. He really needs no introduction, but I will simply mention that prior to his position at Yad Vashem, Mr. Dayan served as Israel's Consul General in New York and as the CEO of Elad Software Systems. Mr. Dayan will be speaking to us today about the fundamental ideas, patterns, and phenomena that recur throughout history and on the role that Holocaust remembrance plays in combating anti-Semitism. Mr. Dayan, you have the floor for 13 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna Michelle, and thank you so much for your wonderful words, introductory words. And I don't mean my introduction, by the introduction. This panel, it was extremely inspiring. I would like also, with your permission, to thank Greece for the presidency of IHRA. It has been a great presidency of this important organization, alliance, and I would like to share with you that the 2 co-chairpersons of IHRA, one representing the Israeli delegation of IHRA, one representing the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the other representing Yad Vashem, have applied to IHRA to present Israel's candidacy to be to the presidency of IHRA in 2025, when we will mark 80 years, the end of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. Before I plunge into our topic in a day like this, and I cannot avoid to say that one of the most important long-term lessons of World War II was the understanding that disagreements and conflicts of interest between countries should be resolved through diplomatic channels and through diplomatic channels alone. Taking military measures always has serious, negative, and sometimes unforeseen consequences that can be extremely tragic. We regret that this important lesson was violated in the invasion of Ukraine by Russia's military force. In addition to that, I must say that the propagandistic discourse that accompanies the current war is saturated with irresponsible statements and historically incorrect comparisons with the behavior of the peoples involved during the war and with the Holocaust. We condemn at Yad Vashem the shallowing use of the memory of the Holocaust and its lessons in the current military conflict. Anna Michelle, you mentioned that I was Israel's Consul General to New York, and I want to share you something quite personal. When I arrived to New York to represent the state of Israel, the Jewish state, among other things, to the largest Jewish community outside of Israel, I believed that anti-Semitism will not be high on my agenda. I thought that we had more pressing issues in the United States and in general than anti-Semitism. I remember when my friend David Harris, that we heard his impressive presentation just half an hour ago, as always, an excellent presentation. I remember that he invited me to assist memorial to Mireille Knoll. Mireille Knoll was an octogenarian Holocaust survivor that was assassinated in an anti-Semitic attack in Paris, France. And I saw on the screen 11 faces of Jews that were murdered in France over a decade in anti-Semitic attacks, in Toulouse, in Paris, and elsewhere. I was shocked. 11 Jews in the 21st century in a decade are murdered in Europe. I thought that the situation in America would be different. And it indeed started slowly. It started with desecration of cemeteries. and then came Charlottesville, Virginia. When Charlottesville, Virginia occurred, and I saw the Nazi flag displayed in an American city, in the grounds of an important university in an American city, it was difficult for me to believe my eyes. I'm not criticizing the First Amendment, but in most countries that would be not only morally repugnant, but also criminally punishable. But nothing prepared me for Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was part of my jurisdiction. I arrived to Pittsburgh on that Shabbat, in which 11 Jews were murdered in anti-Semitic attack when the bodies were still lying on the floor. I stayed for an entire week, probably one of the most difficult weeks of my life. And then came Poway, California, and the kosher grocery in Jersey City, New Jersey, and the Hanukkah celebration in Muncie, New York. 15 Jews murdered, not attacked, not harassed, murdered, assassinated in less than 2 years on American soil. Unfortunately, that alarming problem is not an American one only. It plagues Europe as well, it plagues Latin America. It plagues also our host country in this important event, Greece. The role of Holocaust remembrance in combating anti-Semitism and racism is central, and it is potentially effective. And I say potentially because it can be effective only if it's based on accuracy. Holocaust remembrance has to be accurate in order to be effective. We in Yad Vashem and many of our colleagues in other institutions, we see ourselves as the guardians of accuracy. Because today, more than there is a problem of Holocaust denial, there is a problem of Holocaust distortion. And we have to be the guardians of Holocaust accuracy if we want to be effective. That is the reason that when I assumed this position of chairman of Yad Vashem a few months ago, I decided that 2 basic activities of Yad Vashem will be enhanced. One is documentation. We will continue to strive to gather every single document in the most remote archives in the world that we can, because we need to know everything about the Holocaust, and we need to know it accurately. We speak a lot about, and this is a conference that is forward-looking. We speak a lot about the era in which Holocaust survivors will be no more with us anymore. But the documentation, the documents, and we have 200 million documents in Yad Vashem and still counting. Those are the testimonies of 6 million Jews that were never able to stand in front of the camera and give their testimony or write their memoirs. And the second is research. Research is essential. Research based on that documentation is essential these days more than ever, is the greatest way to combat Holocaust distortion. My friends, I believe that Holocaust remembrance to be effective to be significant, should stand on 4 pillars. The first pillar is mourning. 6 million Jews massacred deserve mourning. Holocaust remembrance sites are not sites to raise flags, are sites to bow heads, to shed tears, and to reflect or pray silently. But mourning is not enough by itself. The second pillar on which we should base Holocaust remembrance is knowledge, as I said. And I want to explain why we are so obsessed. And I use the word obsessed in spite of the fact that obsession usually has negative connotations. We are so obsessed on gathering one more name of a victim of the Holocaust, one more picture, one more document, one more artifact. Obviously, it's for the sake of the future, as I already hinted, to combat attempts to distort the Holocaust. It's for the sake of the present to combat anti-Semitism. But I believe that it has one more additional purpose that is not less important. I think that knowing everything about the Holocaust is a debt we owe to the victim. And let me share with you something that really haunts me constantly since I am chairman of Yad Vashem. I think about a figurative young Jewish girl, let's say 12 years old. Let's call her Sarah or Leah or Gittel, from Bialystok in Poland or other place. Let's say Bialystok. She was pushed by the German Nazis and their collaborators into the local synagogue, crammed there with hundreds of her fellow congregants, something that unfortunately happened, and they were set afire. I am sure that that young Jewish girl, in the last moments of her life, when she grasped what is going to happen to her, she expected us to know about her everything. Who she was, who were her parents, how she died, how did she look like, what were her expectations in life. We owe it to her. The third is to try to identify with the victim. In the Haggadah, in the Passover Haggadah Shel Pesach, we say in Hebrew every year, בכל דור ודור חייב אדם לראות את עצמו כאילו הוא יצא ממצרים. In every generation has a person to see himself or herself as if he or she personally were liberated. I believe that since the Shoah, every decent person has to see himself or herself as if he or she were personally liberated from Auschwitz. And we have to provide the tools to humanity in order to identify, to feel with museums, with education, many other activities, imaginative activities. And last but not least, and we conclude with that, we have to learn lessons from the Shoah. And I want to be very clear, there are many lessons from the Shoah. Some of them are personal, some are national, some are universal. And as long as those lessons are carved out from the facts by decent persons, all of them are legitimate. Ele ve'ele divrei Elohim chayim, we say in Hebrew. These and these are the word of a living God. But I am entitled also to my lessons. And my lessons that I would like to share with you to conclude are two. The first one, the vital
We've lost Mr. Dayan. Let's give him a moment just in case. Technology has many positive things, but unfortunately, like everything, there are moments when it fails us.
Do you hear me?
We can hear you, yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I will conclude by saying that the second is when you see anti-Semitism, combat it immediately, forcibly, and decisively before it metastasizes into a monstrous machine of annihilation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chairman Dayan. It's really for that really touching intervention and the excellent suggestions. I'm so very pleased that we can be discussing these issues today. And I want to also thank, while I introduce the Rabbi, I would also like to thank, you're in Washington, right, Rabbi? Is that where you're joining us from? I would also like to thank the American Embassy and the Fulbright Foundation for lending their support to this event. So it's my pleasure, Rabbi, to introduce you. Rabbi Andrew Baker is AJC's Director of International Jewish Affairs, a leading expert on anti-Semitism in Europe, and his role at the AJC involves strengthening the relations between the AJC and Jewish communities worldwide. Rabbi Baker has served as the personal representative of the OSCE chairman in office on combating anti-Semitism since 2009. And in his intervention will give us a broad overview of the efforts undertaken over the last 20 to 30 years to address Holocaust-era issues with a focus in Central and Eastern Europe. So, Rabbi, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours for 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. It is, of course, great to be with all of you in Greece, at least virtually, this new normal way of meeting. With remembrance is, of course, the need, the challenge for education. Additionally, perhaps in some ways even more difficult, bringing redress to those victims of the Holocaust in this case, and their heirs. It has been a particular challenge in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which after the Holocaust were subjugated to half a century of communist domination, communist teaching. So to confront critically and openly a history that took place only decades earlier was even more difficult. Thus, it was notable at the beginning of this week that Latvian President Levits signed into law legislation that literally took decades to come to fruition, that provides for the payment, a rather modest sum, I might say, of 40 million euro to cover the remaining claims against former looted Jewish communal property, earless Jewish properties stolen during the Nazi time and then nationalized under communism. It put, perhaps one could say, a period to that process that had gone on for so long. In one way, I would suggest that process began in 1998. Latvia, other countries in the Baltic region and in Eastern Europe were poised to make the case to join NATO. And much of that debate and discussion centered here in Washington. It then fell to me, be warned in advance, but to receive a phone call from Lennart Meri, then president of Estonia. President Meri invited me to visit him in Tallinn, but notably to accompany him a day later to a summit meeting in Riga of the three Baltic presidents. That was intended for us to have a discussion that led to announcements that took place at the end of that summit by each of these presidents to create international historical commissions. A first step, critical step, to examining the history of the Holocaust in each of those countries. This became, as we can look back and fully recognize, a complicated process, certainly not a straight line in any of these countries. But it was really understood by those presidents and by those governments that to become a member of NATO, to make the case that was so important in Washington, it was necessary to show that one could look carefully and critically at the country's history and addressing the legacy of the Holocaust that took place in each of these countries. It was the common thread, if you will, that ran through all of these NATO candidate countries. And so it's particularly ironic, I guess one could say, these very days, that the fact that these countries now have the benefit of NATO membership and the benefit of Article 5, that perhaps never seemed so critical or important as it does right now, in some measure was due to a willingness to address these issues and this history of the Holocaust in their respective countries. I think we need to keep in mind that this was not an easy process even for the countries of Western Europe, where there was no barrier even in the years immediately following the end of the war to look carefully and critically at what happened. We know quite well that, for example, it was only in 1995 that France acknowledged its own responsibility for the deportation and murder of those 70,000 Jews in France. Also in that same year, as our friend Hannah Lessing can tell us only too well, I know she's with you, in Greece, only in 1995 did Austria step forward to accept its own responsibility and create a national fund to address the needs, the claims of Austrian Holocaust victims. Much of what happened, and certainly what happened in Central and Eastern Europe, wouldn't have happened without this outside pressure. But it would not have succeeded without the ultimate acceptance and embrace of the need to do this by the new democratic post-communist political leadership in each of these countries. Much of the efforts to address some of these unfinished issues centered in Washington, certainly during the Clinton administration, almost single-handedly marshaled by Stu Eisenstadt. So many of those issues, the need to address dormant Swiss bank accounts, bring to bear the issue of looted Nazi gold in various Western European countries, addressing unclaimed Holocaust insurance policies, dealing with German industry's use of slave labor during the Holocaust. All of this was also being brought to bear. As one New York Times reporter described it at the time, this was history born again as news. Notably, as this audience surely is aware, there were European efforts to ensure that Holocaust history would be known to a younger generation, of course, marked by the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust in 2000. We've seen the establishment of an International Day of Holocaust Remembrance, January 27th. Of course, the Swedish Prime Minister who convened that forum understood the need to teach about the Holocaust to his own population. And a remarkable demonstration of this, a book was published, Tell Ye Your Children, an account of the Holocaust that was printed and distributed to every household in Sweden. But let's also bear in mind that it was only some years after that that this history of the Holocaust was revised to then include a chapter that dealt with the Holocaust in Sweden and the complicated story of what that meant. So, dealing with this issue, particularly the challenge we've seen in Central and Eastern Europe, has echoes of what's gone on elsewhere in Europe. I think one of the points one can make in all of these efforts, certainly when we have made efforts to address Holocaust era property claims, Jewish communal property and private property seized by the Nazis, then nationalized under communism, those early meetings, the pressure, if you will, as NATO membership loomed, led to negotiations on property restitution and compensation. And none of that happened quickly or easily. It fell to me to lead negotiations, for example, with the government of Lithuania. My friend and colleague who worked with us during those years, I know, is with you as well, Faina Kukliansky, the chair of the Jewish community of Lithuania. That negotiation process went on for 10 years. It had frequent interruptions. Notably, whenever an election loomed, our government negotiators said, we need to pause. Always there was the sense even when that government and when those political leaders knew this was the right thing to do, that, well, if they moved too quickly, if they acted in such a way to make redress, they feared they would lose the votes of their population, that this would be viewed as something negative. And so we always were up against the sense, even as I said, when the leaders on the other side knew this was rectifying an historical wrong, but troubled that it would be unpopular, would play into the anti-Semitic attitudes that were still present in many of these countries.
Rabbi, can I ask you just to be conscious of the time a little bit? We'll have another round.
I will, and let me conclude now. Sorry. One of the notable areas where we focused had been in the issue of addressing the history of the Holocaust in Romania, a country that in 2003, its own president asserted that no Holocaust took place in Romanian territory. At the time, waiting for NATO membership just a year away, the foreign minister of Romania understood the need to create an historical commission there, which took place. In fact, Elie Wiesel agreed to serve as chairman. Ironically, a president of Romania, partly a problem that he caused, helped solve the problem by creating this commission. History was well known. Historians from Yad Vashem and Holocaust Museum in Washington contributed to this. And ultimately, we saw a concrete history, decision for a memorial to be established, and yet all falling to his successor, President Băsescu. At the time when a memorial was established, even he was hesitant, though he did not say so publicly, to put in place the memorial plaque that explained that history. He agreed ultimately to do it, but only after elections took place. Yet another sign of someone who knew the right thing to do, but was nervous about doing it. And so, and with this I'll conclude, it is truly remarkable and praiseworthy that it fell to Romania in 2016, at the time Ambassador Mircea Constantinescu, to bring under IHRA the working definition of anti-Semitism, something that had been developed earlier by the no longer functioning European Monitoring Center, but has now become surely the most important tool in fighting anti-Semitism in Europe and elsewhere in the world. If one can't define it, one can't confront it, one can't combat it. And so with the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, we find ourselves able to continue to extend this important battle. With that, let me conclude and thank you for this opportunity to speak to all of you.
Thank you, Andrew. And we all thank IHRA for that, I'm sure. And also, just to let you know, in Parliament, I sit next to President Băsescu, who is now a member of the European Parliament. So I'll make sure and dog him about his future lawmakers. And with this, I will give the floor to our third speaker this afternoon, Jennifer Giardelli. Jennifer directs the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's initiative on the Holocaust and professional leadership. This initiative creates educational resources and programs for professionals charged with protecting life and liberty, such as law enforcement and the military. In addition to her role at the museum, Jennifer is a member of the U.S. delegation to IHRA. So Jennifer, the floor is yours for 8 minutes, and I very much look forward to your intervention so you can tell us about your work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Thank you. I am grateful to be here from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and sorry to not be in person in beautiful Kalamata. I'd like to thank the organizers for making this event possible, even with all of the continued complications of the pandemic. And I do want to note my deep concern about the events that are happening in Ukraine as we speak now. Today, I'm going to speak about preventing mass atrocities through educational programs that influence the health of our societies, and those are law enforcement, judiciary, military. I'll talk about the program that we've been running at the museum for over 2 decades, and then just give some highlights of a current project that we're working on with the Department of State. And I am going to share my screen for this, and hopefully that's not going to cause problems. Right. So I'd like to start, this project that I'll talk about is actually going to bring some of these tools and knowledge to global criminal justice professionals globally. So I'd like to start with a case study from the Holocaust that we use in our programs, and it focuses on November 1938, Kristallnacht, when the Nazi regime instigated a night of violence targeting Jewish homes and businesses and synagogues. We know that the SA was instrumental in carrying out the violence, but we also know that police forces, German police forces, received an order that evening. And you see here an excerpt from that primary source document. But this is a document we use with police participants, police professionals, to discuss that event in more detail. And what stands out for them about this document, many note that police are given notice of lawlessness that's about to occur. They're encouraged to stand down. No foreign Jews are to be blamed. They don't want international incidents. So we discuss what is revealed in this language. Then we look at how this order played out across Germany, using examples of different responses while considering questions such as, what options did police commanders have in responding to the order? What was the context in which these orders were issued? Now, as Alan Steinweiss and many others have pointed out, most German policemen did exactly as they had been ordered, which was to stand down and do nothing. Still, we consider a range of responses, including that of Wilhelm Kritzfeld, a precinct captain in Berlin, who used an existing law to prevent the burning of a synagogue in his district. Police participants are often shocked that Kritzfeld could do this and experience no serious repercussions, and that challenges a belief or misconception that going along was the only option, otherwise people would have been shot. This examination, and it's complicated, right? But the program creates an opportunity to raise discussion questions about motivations and pressures, about the range of possible choices and actions, and about professional responsibility. So this is an example of how the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum strives to do our educational work, which is to inspire critical thinking and self-reflection about how and why the Holocaust happened in ways that are relevant. This approach applies to all of our audiences and also our work with professionals. And in fact, it was after observing one of our programs that staff at the Department of State's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Bureau approached us with a project idea. And the International Criminal Justice Leadership Project, or ICJL, emerged, and I'll only provide some highlights. We don't have time, obviously, for detail, but project outputs, this is an ongoing project, and outputs will include free and publicly available mass atrocity prevention educational modules and guidance for global criminal justice professionals, and the Holocaust will be a central case study. Now, the project, which is still underway, allows the museum to blend our decades-long experience with professionals with the scholarship expertise of the museum's Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. The Simon Skjodt Center pursues scholarship about mass atrocity and offers warning to stakeholders, policymakers, the public, about current crises, such as that of the Rohingya or the Uyghurs. And they inform policymakers and stakeholders about tools that can prevent genocide. Now, one such tool is the Center's Early Warning Project, which uses quantitative and qualitative inputs to assess countries' risk of atrocity. And as was just referenced earlier, atrocities never appear out of nowhere. There are always steps, there are always risk factors, there are always warning signs. So this public-facing tool allows anyone really to examine a country of interest through a mass atrocity lens. Now, this early warning project, again, punctuates the process of genocide, and that combines with our educational approach of remembering that a path to genocide is paved with choices and decisions made by individuals in roles at national, state, and local levels. So when we started this project, we conducted some preliminary research of the field, and we discovered that this project is innovative and that there are very few atrocity prevention resources that currently exist specifically examining the role of criminal justice actors in mass atrocity scenarios. And the scan illuminated some principles that we use to guide our work forward, such as criminal justice professionals are in positions to counter mass atrocities because of their interface with communities, because of their responsibility for security issues, because of their close relationship to laws and systems that influence the health of communities. This also means that criminal justice professionals are in positions to perpetrate. So we have to be sensitive to recognizing this reality and raise the range of choices that include not only helping civilians, but harming civilians in the name of doing one's job. Criminal justice professionals can experience personal risk for taking action, and while Creutzfeldt experienced no consequences, that's not always the case. So we must have that on the radar for discussion, and it's the responsible thing to do. And we have to be sensitive to not insinuating that participants or countries involved are singularly involved because of their risk for genocide. All of us have risks that make genocide a potential, although again, genocide is rare. But for that reason, we framed this project around leadership considerations, thinking about complex decision-making, influences on decision-making, and also thinking about the role that these folks play as leaders in their communities. Finally, it's really important that when we use historical case studies or contemporary case studies, that those are humanized, that they include survivor testimony, that they show the people who are involved by these events. I'll wrap up now by just saying that preliminary results from this work have indicated that participants, the professionals, have thought differently about their role in preventing mass atrocities, that the Holocaust case study resonated even for those professionals in places where the Holocaust did not occur. They appreciated the focus on leadership. They appreciated the survivor testimony and the videos that were used. And they were very interested in issues of transitional justice and resilience. So while any work on this topic is never enough, this is one important tool that can be offered for mass atrocity prevention, but the professional development must be dynamic. It isn't a training of just memorizing lists. It involves discussion, critical thinking, self-reflection, and application. And it has proven that the Holocaust can be a powerful illustration to help educate about prevention today. So thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing these lessons learned from your impressive work with us today. I don't know if you can teach bravery, but you can certainly reinforce it and fortify it and promote it. And thank you again. So we move now to you, William Spencer, the Executive Director of the Institute of International Law and Human Rights, with almost 25 years of professional experience in diplomacy, human rights, and governance. Previously, the senior duty officer in the White House Situation Room. And you are going to talk to us today from your speaking points, I see, about 3 ways to address atrocities: prevention, the response during and immediately after the atrocity was committed, and the long-term recovery prospects. So please, Spence, the floor is yours for 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, although I very much regret that I cannot be in Kalamata and we have to do this by Zoom. I want to thank the minister and the Metropolitan and all of the folks who brought this really important, thought-provoking gathering together. And I promise I'm going to keep it down to 8 minutes. And I apologize in advance to the translators because sometimes I speak a bit fast, but I'll try to slow it down. Just to start right now, if the theme of the past is to remember it, so as to safeguard the future, I want to focus on recent events that can actually illustrate where we are and where we're headed in the future. And of course, our record is mixed at best. And while the 3 strategies I mentioned are necessary tools, and they're being developed as we speak, they're not sufficient to prevent atrocities. Just for your background, my work on these matters started with Bosnia in the early 1990s. I was served on the International Criminal Court delegation and the negotiations to establish that institution. And for the last 15 years, I've worked on human rights and accountability issues in Iraq. And because of the Iraq experience, I wanted to set these three tools against what I have seen and what I saw during the war against ISIS in Iraq predominantly, but also in Syria. And I want to start first with some good news, and this sort of echoes Jennifer's intervention. There's a lot of steps forward in trying to raise awareness and try to prevent atrocities before they happen. And of course, after Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, I count 6 major events. 1, the Rome Statute. 2, the European Council in 2002 established a European network for investigation and prosecution of war crimes. In the Genocide Network Secretariat was established as part of Eurojust. That's 2. In 2005, an important moment when all member states of the UN committed to the doctrine of responsibility to protect. 4, in 2011, President Obama declared that preventing mass atrocities was a core U.S. national interest and a moral responsibility, and he ordered the creation of the U.S. government's Atrocity Prevention Board. I have to say that was an optimistic start, but unfortunately it was later downgraded to the Atrocities Early Warning Working Group by President Trump. In 2018, U.S. Congress passed the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act, which further strengthened U.S. atrocity prevention capacity and took a whole-of-government approach, including training diplomats along the lines of what Jennifer was doing. And then finally, 6, there's been a huge explosion of government and civil society networks that are committed to atrocity prevention, and this has been all over the world. We have an R2P focal point established. We have the Global Alliance Against Mass Atrocity Crimes, and of course, again, to mention Jennifer's intervention, we have the Simon Scott Center at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So that's sort of the beginning of this, and that's the background, the hopeful background. So let me just go into 3 different approaches. One is prevention and looking at this in terms of what happened in Iraq and the war against Daesh. As somebody has said, as Alex Bellamy has said, it is morally, politically, financially, and prudentially better to prevent atrocity crimes than to react to stop them once underway. And we all know that inaction can have grave consequences. And this is painfully apparent when we look at Syria and Iraq. As many as 15,000 are dead. And by the way, there is no reliable count of the actual death count in this war. And as many as 6,000 to 9,000 Yazidi women and girls were victims of sexual violence and sexual slavery. And by the way, today, as many as 3,000 of these women and girls are still missing, and Yazidi leaders claim that they're still held. One thing I wanted to say about prevention is that many underestimated ISIS capabilities. And as been noted before, ISIS was quite explicit about what they intended to do if they ever had the chance to take over. But nobody really thought they were capable of holding territory. And I think one of the big factors for ISIS advancing as it did in northern Iraq is that a lot of Iraqi politicians thought they could be easily manipulated and controlled and leveraged to pursue these Iraqi political extremist agendas. And in Athens, in Baghdad, in Washington, and Brussels, there was really little idea of ISIS' true capabilities, notwithstanding the fact that they laid it all out there. And I want to say that prevention is much more than making predictions about intentions, though. Prevention requires specific techniques to identify and manage risk. It means supporting society and enabling a society to better confront these risks. And sadly, the record is not good. ISIS crimes were not prevented at the outset. Now I go to the second block of this. And the second is better responses. When war crimes and crimes against humanity are on the march, private groups, governments, and international organizations have to directly respond to the events and provide tools to prevent perpetrators so they can ultimately change the perpetrator's behavior. And as a former boss once told me, he goes, the first job of a human rights activist is to document the crimes to keep the perpetrators accountable. And in the case of Iraq, this was done immediately by groups like the Iraqi High Commission for Human Rights and NGOs that are Iraqi, like Yazda and Shlomo. And it's really interesting because when all this was happening, we were trying to deploy teams to document in theater, and international organizations and governments did not want to deploy any of these teams, and they cited security concerns. Nadia Murad went around the world, and she ultimately received the Nobel Peace Prize. And in other good news on response, the United Nations Security Council later established UNITAD, which is a special UN organization that is tasked to investigate crimes and build accountability. So that's part of the good news. Another part of response is that vulnerable groups must be protected as part of any response. And when the Yazidi home of Sinjar, which is a district in the north, fell to ISIS in August 2014, everyone was stunned. And in response, the US government was airdropping supplies to those who were left on Sinjar Mountain, the last fighters that ISIS could not quell. And they worked to establish an evacuation corridor to Syria that might have saved as many as 60,000 lives. And while this is almost certainly a case of too little too late, we can also see, on the other hand, that thousands of lives were saved as part of this response. And of course, we have to say that the initial decision for airdrops and airstrikes gave full impetus to the anti-ISIS coalition and was a turning point in the war against ISIS. So that's response. 3, recovery. The documentation efforts like the ones led by UNITAD, which is still investigating to this day, and others can play a healing role in documenting what happened, and building accountability processes can help spur longer-term reconciliation. In the aftermath of atrocities, supporting recovery is vital. This includes justice and accountability. It includes healing and reconciliation processes. And most of all, it requires political transition and economic recovery, the underpinnings for all of this. In post-ISIS Iraq, unfortunately, the recovery side is also thin. Today in Syria, tens of thousands of ISIS combatants and their families are being held in makeshift camps, which is incubating further atrocity crimes in the future as we speak. There is no plan to address what to do with these prisoners short of indefinite detention. That is a fact. UNITAD, after all of the excitement about establishing this investigative group, to this day has not shared any evidence with the Iraqi judiciary on what they've found. And the crime of genocide and crimes against humanity are not on the books in the Iraqi legal system. So as many as 30,000 ISIS fighters have been tried by the Iraqi judiciary under a 2005 anti-terror law, which is not a war crime. There are reportedly a single case that was brought before the courts of sexual violence that was brought before the courts in Iraq, a single case. And I want to say this, UNITAD's inability or unwillingness to share its evidence with Iraqi judges is a tremendous opportunity lost, not only for the international community, but most importantly, for the victims who deserve answers. And I do want to shift towards my conclusion. Finally, there's one ray of sunshine. In March of last year, the Iraqi parliament passed the Yazidi Survivors Law, which provides a wide range of reparations, not just for the Yazidi, but also Christian, Shabak, and Turkmen victims. And this support might start coming to victims as early as June this year. So let me just conclude, and I see I'm at 10 minutes here. So what we see in the case of ISIS is, as a colleague put it, the international community plodding along. While there's more infrastructure and legal framework and monitoring mechanisms than ever, what is required is an engaged response from our leaders at the beginning. As a parenthesis, the Atrocities Prevention Board was sidelined as soon as any major foreign policy event happened, bureaucratically. We can see that today we have not prevented an Iraq or a Daesh caliphate. And while there have been small successes, this framework is necessary, but not sufficient. And I want to close with Elie Wiesel's words about the Holocaust when in 2012. And Elie Wiesel said, "It could have been prevented. The greatest tragedy in history could have been prevented had the civilized world spoken up taken measures in 1939, 1940, 41, 42. Each time in Berlin, Goebbels and the others wanted to see what would be the reaction in Washington and Rome and London. And there was no reaction, so they felt they could continue. So in this place, we may ask, have we learned anything from it? And if so, how is Bashar al-Assad still in power? He said that in 2012. And I want to say again, the theme of this about the future is that necessary but not sufficient. At the end of the day, to avert atrocities in the future, we need more than just analysis, reporting, and capacity. This is only a start. And we need leaders who will take action. And I'll end with a quote from President Obama himself, which says, remembrance without resolve is a hollow gesture. Awareness without action changes nothing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Spence. When I asked my my assistant William for someone who knew a lot about Iraq, he wasn't kidding when he found me you. So thank you very much for giving us this perspective. But I'm conscious that we lost the connection with Danny Dayan a little bit before, and I was hoping that you would be able to expand a little bit more on fighting the good fight. I think we've heard enough now from our panelists. Maybe we can take that a step further. And let me just preface this by saying that I just got back from the United Arab Emirates last night, and it was really interesting for me. I mean, I went there to the agenda was to see the results of the Abraham's Accords on trades, because I'm the vice chair of the International Trade Committee in Parliament. But I had a lot of discussions with officials on what they're doing to combat hate speech. I saw the Israeli ambassador, and I'm just thinking, I mean, I'm a very free trade oriented person, and I'm thinking, is this, and the European Union is obviously based on creating hopefully peace, not doing a great job on that today, but also bringing us together in the basis of, trading. So I'm wondering if you would like to make a comment, aside from, what we do further to fight anti-Semitism and the future-proof ourselves, if you feel, if you have an assessment on what this has done, what the Abraham Accords have actually done in this direction.
Is that to me, or is it?
That's to Mr. Dayan.
Ah, good.
We're going around again. Yeah. We need you to unmute yourself, Mr. Dayan, because I can't do that. No. Yes.
Okay. So anyway, I am very optimistic about the effects of the Abraham Accords on the topic we are discussing, and I will tell you why. Because I said, I hinted earlier that Holocaust denial is not a real problem today. We have a very serious problem of Holocaust distortion, Holocaust trivialization, but no serious leader today in the world, no serious intellectual, no serious journalist, no serious influencer will deny today, as they used to do in the last decades of the previous century, that the Holocaust really occurred. There are many reasons why outright Holocaust denial disappeared. Probably the harsh verdict in the David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt trial influenced the 3 consecutive visits by popes to Yad Vashem, put an end to Catholic Holocaust denial, and the Stockholm Declaration and IHRA itself to diplomatic denial of the Holocaust. But we still see, unfortunately, signs of outright Holocaust denial on 2 places. One that doesn't bother me is the lunatic fringes of the social media. Why doesn't it bother me? Because in the lunatic fringes of the social media, you can find any garbage, anything, and therefore it will not disappear. But we still see, unfortunately, outright Holocaust denial in some places in the Muslim world, and not only in Iran. not only the Prime Minister of Malaysia and not only the President of Iran or President or former, but we see that even in much wider places. That's the reason why I think that the Abraham Accords, if one day Saudi Arabia joins the Abraham Accords, even better. The fact that the Holocaust education is starting in the UAE, in Bahrain, and in other Arab countries is extremely, extremely important. I had the privilege to host in Yad Vashem the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee of the Majlis of the Parliament in the United Arab Emirates, Dr. Ali Rashid Al Nuaimi. And after he signed in Arabic the book of guests in Yad Vashem, he spoke to the press. And it was so impressive the way in which he said the duty to fight anti-Semitism that we see in Europe, in America, and in the Arab world is not the responsibility of the Jews, it's the responsibility of every decent person, and we should take the leadership on that. It was so impressive. I can also say that I will maintain next week a Zoom meeting with the director of the Crossroads of Civilizations museum in Dubai, and I am sure we will start a very, very fruitful cooperation. Therefore, since the main problem today in Holocaust denial is in the Muslim world, I think that the Abraham Accords can be an extremely useful antidote to fight that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ali and I had the opportunity to discuss this yesterday, and really the work that's being done is very, very impressive. I think that the cooperation between you can only bring further benefits. Now, let me just ask Vasiliki Keramida if there is anybody from the audience that would like to pose a question to a particular panelist before we do a final round. All right, I don't see anything.
There is nobody.
Okay, if there is something that comes up, we're here. So I'll walk now, Spence, I'll come back to you. So you don't have to talk about the Abraham Accords if you don't want, but you can just give us maybe your final thoughts on all this, and we'll go around, do a round and wrap it up. And if you want to give us a quote, you're welcome to. Although you have provided us with, I have 11 minutes of good stuff, but.
Yeah, well, it was a little bit over the 8, I think.
No problem. No. I'm delighted. I'd like to be doing this forever, but the organizers keep texting me. So there you go.
Well, and what I would say is the Abraham Accords is the way to reduce the other in all of these discussions. It is a lot of my Arab friends are ecstatic about it, and they've had ongoing relationships with Israeli businessmen for years, and this normalizes something. And it becomes less of a question of those guys and becomes a proposition for all of us. And I think that's a very, very hopeful thing. I again want to go back to the need to think systemically about response to atrocity crimes, especially as we look at what's happening in Ukraine. And with Ukraine, I would want to just throw out 3 big words, which is right now, what can we do as human rights people who want to make a difference? And I would say document. So that is one thing nobody can stop you doing. And we don't know the scope of what's happening, and it's still early days, but this is something I would encourage all of us to do, and that's a positive step we can take.
Okay, Spence, that's crystal clear. Thank you very much. Jennifer, I'm going to come to you, not just on this, but I'm going to want to play the female angle to this. I have to say I've been really working very closely with a lot of women who have been championing this fight, and I know you obviously address yourself in a completely gender neutral way in the work that you're doing, but I take this opportunity to just ask you if you feel. I sometimes feel that women can be a conduit for a lot of this stuff in a different way. especially when you're trying to, and maybe that's just because I'm, half Jewish, half Christian, and I have to balance this within myself. But even in the Arab world, I find that balancing all this is something that maybe it's just me, maybe it's just easier for me to relate to how women do this. But I thought, I'd take advantage of the fact that you're on the panel and ask you if you feel like to make a comment in that direction. Otherwise, we're here to hear your final words.
I think I'm often conscious of being not in the museum world where there are many, or in the educational world where there are many women who are involved, but certainly in the work with military, it's not unusual, especially with our work with international officers, that I might be one of only a couple of women in the room and leading sessions, even in a global context, from professionals who come from parts of the world where women play a whole range of roles. I don't know. So I'm conscious of it in that regard. I think that we focus on the work. We all have important work to do, and we all have shared interests in terms of what that work entails. And I think this panel has been a wonderful illustration that there is no one path of solution, and nothing that any of us does is really enough in the face of these monumental challenges. Yet all of it is absolutely essential, and all of it complements itself. And so the better that we can be, I think, at finding the places where policy and program can intersect and complement each other, I think that's a real way that we can help advance this work. And that's, I think, what the IHRA does in a unique way, right? To have diplomats and practitioners come together. And I would say that the more we can be creative of finding maybe the unsuspecting points of entry. And from the educational world, I would say, while obviously it's essential that we educate our youth, people who were not alive in any way close to the time of the Holocaust, need to learn about it. Yet, if we neglect engaging adults and professionals in this education, and education, not simply training, can you teach courage? I don't know, but we have to engage in thoughtful ways that draw on people's lived experiences. And I'll close with a quote from a colonel, a retired U.S. Air Force Colonel, Ed Westerman, who years back had made the point about engaging military professionals in this sort of education, was that if the first time you're thinking about these issues is on the ground in Baghdad, it's too late. So if we can get folks early, that contributes to our cause. So thank you again for the conversation and opportunity to be here today.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Rabbi, as you can hear from my accent, I'm a big believer in the transatlantic relationship being a part of it. So this is one of the reasons I work so closely with Transatlantic Friends of Israel as its president to champion this fight across the Atlantic and bring us together and closer and make us more effective. So are you as big a believer as I am in the work that we're doing together, or what can we do to make it better?
Oh, I certainly share that, and yes, I am a big believer in this. In fact, in addressing the resurgence of anti-Semitism going back now 20 years, which we first saw in Europe, it really was a transatlantic direction and approach. The OSCE is one international organization in which both the United States and Europe sit around the same table. And so it was, I think, that when we heard from Jews in Europe of what they were experiencing, those concerns were taken up by people here in Washington, members of Congress and others in their own meetings with European leaders. I think what emerged from that was this common effort to address that problem, a problem which unfortunately is still with us. But there are so many more tools now that have been developed to work on this, in which we do see this common collaboration having produced them. As we've already noted, the definition on anti-Semitism, guides for addressing security needs, as well as educational efforts. All of this, we see it in the OSCE, but we see it in other international bodies as well, reflect, I think, this very real shared concern and experience that, frankly, you represent in the role you play, chairing this transatlantic Friends of Israel.
I would like to thank you all for this wonderful discussion. Thank the organizers. I wish I could close with some, words of wisdom. If I were going to choose to close with something, it would probably just be a prayer for peace at this point. But since I would kindly ask Danny Dayan from Israel to close this panel. I'm sure you, Danny, will find some words of wisdom that at this moment clearly are not with me.
Well, I would like to add a word about the thought about the war against anti-Semitism. I spoke about rampant anti-Semitism in many continents, but make no mistake, we are not in Europe of the 30s. There is a huge difference between those terrible days and our days regarding anti-Semitism, at least. I'm not talking about geopolitics now. But there is also a difference between our generation and the generation of the 30s. Our generation has the experience that generation lacked. That generation probably couldn't imagine that anti-Semitism can develop into such a monstrous machine of extermination. We know that if it happened once, it can happen twice. Therefore, what I tell all the world leaders that visit Yad Vashem is that confronting anti-Semitism immediately, forcibly, decisively, without reservations, is what makes the difference when you say never again between meaning it or converting it into a shallow cliche. And I hope that the world will confront anti-Semitism now, will not wait until it becomes the terrible thing that it became 80 years ago. And when I say anti-Semitism, I mean anti-Semitism in societies, but I also mean regimes that call for the annihilation of the state of Israel. Let me be clear, when in Tehran they say that they are going to wipe out Tel Aviv from the face of the earth, they don't mean the buildings of Tel Aviv, they mean the Jews of Tel Aviv. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Take good care of yourself. Thanks again. Thank you, Vasiliki.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ την κυρία Σιμακοπούλου που συντόνισε τόσο ωραία αυτό το πάνελ. Το Υπουργείο Παιδείας και Θρησκευμάτων συνεργάζεται πολύ στενά και με το Yad Vashem και με το Holocaust Memorial. Και οι απόψεις του κύριου Μπέικερ, του Ραβίνου Μπέικερ και του κύριου Σπένσερ ήταν πολύτιμες. Μια πολύ ωραία εισαγωγή για την αυριανή ημέρα. Θα περάσουμε σε ένα σύντομο διάλειμμα και θα επιστρέψουμε στις 6 για το τελευταίο μέρος της σημερινής συνάντησης. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Θα μπορούσατε να καθίσετε για να ξεκινήσουμε? Συνεχίζουμε τη σημερινή ημέρα με την κυρία Ζανέτ Πατίνου, Διευθύντρια του Εβραϊκού Μουσείου Ελλάδας, η οποία θα μας μιλήσει για τις σκέψεις πάνω στην εκπαίδευση για το Ολοκαύτωμα στην Ελλάδα. Κυρία Πατίνου, ευχαριστούμε που είστε εδώ, έστω και διαδικτυακά, και σας δίνουμε το λόγο να συνεχίσετε.
Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. Dear conference participants, dear colleagues in IHRA, I would also like to thank the organizers for giving me the honor to address you today and to do it from Athens, where other duties firmly kept me. I want to share with you some thoughts on Holocaust education in Greece, mainly based on the experience of our work at the Jewish Museum of Greece. As the current millennium runs into its third decade, it has already brought us face to face with multiple challenges, and in the past 2 years, with an unprecedented health crisis that ruthlessly altered much in our daily lives and in the international landscape. In this new context, oh, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. I'm meant to share my screen. I don't see the prompt to do so. I'm sorry, I'm going to need some advice here because I'm new to WebEx.
Can you
okay, yes, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. I apologize for this small delay. Here we are. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We are right at the end of the. I apologize for that. Give me 1 second, please. There we go. So, some thoughts on Holocaust education. Trying to, all right. So, back to what I was saying in this, yes. In this new context, museums are called upon to consolidate and expand their important social role and to provide an international and multilingual public with multiple and correlating readings of the past, new ways of thinking and understanding the present, and of positively influencing the vision and creation of a sustainable and inclusive future. As non-formal educational settings, museums can be central in the dissemination of accurate information about the Holocaust and can efficiently supplement the Holocaust education work of schools through a variety of relevant programs. They add specific pedagogical value to the work in the classroom, provide meaningful spaces for commemoration and reflection, and create experiences of authenticity and empathy for the victims. Within this context, the Jewish Museum of Greece introduced Holocaust education in our country and is still the foremost institution that is in close partnership with the Ministry of Education and Religious Affairs, organizes and supports a number of relevant programs every year. Founded 45 years ago, its principal mission is to collect, conserve, research, and exhibit the evidence of more than 2,300 years of Jewish life in the Greek lands, the earliest known settlements of Jews in the European continent. The museum has conducted Holocaust education programs since 1999, seminars for educators since 2004, and has participated through my humble person in the Greek delegation to IHRA since the year 2000 and the meeting in Stockholm. It has developed and dispensed relevant infrastructure and material while facilitating the discourse of Greek Holocaust survivors with the public, with schools, and with universities. As an educational museum upgraded to the status of research center by the Greek Parliament in 2014, the museum has actively partnered with state institutions and the Greek school system in order to address an important social mission. To help augment understanding and respect among people by providing accurate and effective non-formal learning, contributing to the promotion of human rights, ethics, and civic engagement is a powerful bolster for human solidarity of the ideals of democracy, social responsibility, and justice, aiming to inspire proactive and empathetic citizens. A series of memoranda signed with the Ministry of Education and with several international partners aim to support and reinforce the will of the Greek state towards the continuation of reliable programs aimed at the preservation of the legacy of the Holocaust in our country, gradually making it part of a wider redefinition of national consciousness. 22 years later, while this effort is very much in progress, with a long way still to go, one can try to express some thoughts on the basic principles that have governed the implementation of Holocaust education policies and activities in our country. It has become very clear to me that this work is all about people. People who prepare and propose materials, events, opportunities, people who recognize their value and take them up, people who learn and disseminate, people who fund, support, and assist, people around the table at the IHRA meetings who advise and share and cooperate, institutions, organizations, ministries, universities, museums, schools, all are people who care, an exchange between dedicated and determined individuals that we can only hope will keep on growing, expanding and progressing and gaining ground and supporters. So this fight is definitely down at the level of the individual, and it is up to all of us and to every one of us to do our part and to never stop, no matter how small or unclear the results. And there are results, we do see results. It is very important to keep forging partnerships between like-minded people and institutions with similar missions the world over, joining forces, creating strong networks, not wasting time and resources reinventing the wheel, but studying and following the good practices already established, asking questions, listening to opinions, having earnest discussions. Not secondary, knowing the needs and priorities of the people in one's own society and evaluating, choosing, adapting materials for their benefit, for maximum impact and results. Working closely with international organizations such as IHRA, UNESCO, ODIHR, Yad Vashem, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and others to ensure the application in Greece of effective methods and programs of wholesome learning experiences compatible with international guidelines. We are this year, as you heard before by His Excellency, the U.S. Ambassador, realizing an interesting and engaging new project entitled Women and the Holocaust, supported by the U.S. Embassy. Programs for school children, but also for families and adult groups, promote constructive learning, correlating abilities and creativity through a multidisciplinary approach, alternative and comparative methods of learning, applying the experiential approach in order to encourage participants to develop observational and critical capabilities. National and international contacts, exchanges, and partnerships connect Greek teachers in our country and abroad, offering growth opportunities and valuable collegial networks. Establishing and maintaining an optimum implementation on Holocaust programs through careful planning, responsible preparation work, and effective follow-up, and using the functions and components that comprise a museum, its contents and holdings to frame and augment the learning experience and provide authenticity, substance, and credence to build capacity for teachers while providing alternative learning opportunities against the rise of neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism, racism in contemporary societies. The exhibits, artifacts, oral testimonies, and museum narrative relating the history of the Holocaust from the viewpoint of the historical subject offer a view of the full-bodied daily life of ordinary folks, not to be mistaken for a tragic people of victims or martyrs whose only story is their gruesome murder. As museums lost the use of their physical spaces in the past 2 years, they transferred communication and activities in the digital realm. Working against challenging and often overwhelming odds, they continue to respond to the needs and prompts of the public, expanding their hitherto agenda and rethinking their role with an evolving cultural, social, and political landscape at hand in order to serve a society with intensified and unprecedented requirements within a world changing fast, while retaining to the fullest a need for cultural content, for a healing connection with its history, its past, and its roots. Museums evolved into major digital partner content providers for the classroom, turning to thematic applications, digital exhibitions, educational activities, and online seminars. Assisted by the General Secretariat for Religion, we have redesigned and just relaunched a new digital educational environment of the museum, which includes digital lesson plans, updates and information, and a communication platform which houses the efforts of the educators themselves. A virtual tour of the permanent exhibition and thematic video productions open new learning horizons and minimize the restrictions of geography. The museum's products, programs, and projects on the Holocaust, all conducted under the auspices of the Ministry of Education, are in increasing demand excuse me, within the educational community. Among the outreach cooperative activities offered, we have observed that almost 80 years after the event, symbolic programs that propose a creative connection to the Holocaust, involving art, music, horticulture, and other innovative approaches, are the most meaningful and effective for today's school kids. Only two among them I will mention. One is the Crocus Program, designed by the Holocaust Educational Trust of Ireland, and it was introduced by the museum in Greece in 2013. It represents a very popular and unusual way for youngsters to learn about the Holocaust while planting crocus plants, and to reflect this way on the dangers of bigotry and discrimination. More than 760 schools from all over the country have participated in this wonderful program to date. Another is the Butterfly Project, started in 2006 at San Diego Jewish Academy. Introduced at the joint seminar of the Jewish Museum and the Olga Lengyel Institute for Holocaust and Human Rights Education in 2019, this artistic and educational project aims to memorialize the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust. It has become a global and unifying memorial. While every butterfly painted memorializes a child that was lost, it also symbolizes a voice that is gained. Even though introduced just before the pandemic, the Butterfly Project has already been chosen by 27 schools to date. Excuse me. Such teaching and learning opportunities are communicated among many other ways through the numerous seminars for educators under the title Teaching About the Holocaust in Greece that the museum has organized to date in Athens and other Greek cities, reaching out to teachers, librarians, archivists, and museum educators. Many of these seminars have been augmented by partnerships with European and international institutions, such as the Shoah Memorial in Paris, Yad Vashem, the State Auschwitz Memorial Museum, the Olga Lengyel Institute for Holocaust and Human Rights, Education, and others. These partnerships have allowed us to broaden the scope, i.e. to learn about other genocides and about war events in the rest of Europe, and to strengthen the awareness and perspective of participants and multipliers. Close on 2,500 educators have participated in these various seminars that the museum has offered so far. We are currently implementing a European project with 6 partners, supported by the European Commission, connecting Holocaust education with challenging anti-Semitism in urban environments and raising awareness on Jewish life in Europe. Our immediate plans include specialized seminars for target groups such as law enforcement, civil service and judiciary officers, and parliamentarians that would have had taken place 2 years ago, but have been delayed by the pandemic. I will close with a brief introduction to the program connected with the awards that will follow this. In the year 2012, at the invitation of the General Secretariat of Religious Affairs and the Secretary General, Mr. George Galantis, and after much research and planning, the Jewish Museum began a pilot program that resulted in May 2013 in the first ever educational visit of Greek Lyceum students to the State Auschwitz Memorial and Museum, the most emblematic site of remembrance for humanity. Due to the encouraging results and response, the program continued, and in May 2014, 2 groups of students and accompanying teachers visited the Auschwitz Memorial. In 2015, a school contest for a short video production was instituted as part of this program by the ministry and has, over the years, yielded some rare examples of youthful artistry and insight. The program has been implemented every year since then and has come to be thought of as the crown jewel of all Holocaust programs conducted in Greece for the strong and lasting impressions and experiential learning it conveys. Together with the ones that will participate this year, more than 650 students have had the benefit of this lifetime experience. After a hiatus of 2 years, we are back on track, and this year youngsters, assisted by their dedicated teachers, have presented us with yet another series of thought-provoking and sometimes innovative and unusual videos. I want to compliment them, especially for the diligence and planning they dedicated to their productions, for the research, the interviews, the heart, the humanity, the inner self they applied under such difficult, often adverse conditions. It was a brave and generous choice that they made to do this work instead of chatting with peers or playing games in front of their screens. To the teachers and parents, thank you for encouraging, empowering, and helping them. Thank you all for choosing the harder path, which is yet the most rewarding. I also want to express sincere gratitude for the trust and support of the institutional and private sponsors that enable this program, first among them the General Secretariat of Religious Affairs of the Ministry of Education. I also want to thank most sincerely the volunteers and working teams at the museum and the ministry for their tireless and dedicated work towards the realization of this program, for hours of organizational deliberations and problem solving, and for firmly believing in the work that we do. After their visit to the memorial, students are encouraged to record their impressions as a text, a poem, a song. I would like to close these few remarks with the very poignant observations of a 16-year-old student from Athens. Her words constitute a rich reward for us and give us the strength to continue this valuable work. Even before we went to Auschwitz, I knew I would be confronted with horrible images. My study group and I had already come into contact with 2 survivors, read many stories, and gathered information, but I never expected that this part would convey so much negative energy and intense images. Wherever we were, I felt the presence of the unjustly lost souls. Did these bodies ever rest in peace? Did they ever find serenity? Their families never had the chance to mourn them, just as they deserved. This trip led me to embark on a process of thinking how much hatred and anger there is in the world, and that war alienates the soul of humankind. This trip has been a key milestone in my life, leaving me troubled by what I saw and heard. It was a unique experience, and I feel very lucky because I had the opportunity to experience something so rare and unparalleled. I understand the value of everything that I have been given now, because there were people who did not have any opportunities. I hope that everything I saw will become known to everyone, that the Holocaust will become a lesson, and that such atrocities will never be repeated. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ την κυρία Μπατίνου, η οποία έκανε την πιο εξαιρετική εισαγωγή για το διαγωνισμό, τον οποίο διενεργεί η Γενική Γραμματεία Θρησκευμάτων σε συνεργασία με το Εβραϊκό Μουσείο. Φέτος έχουμε τη χαρά την απονομή των 5 πρώτων βραβείων να την κάνουμε εδώ στο συνέδριο στην Καλαμάτα. Παρακαλούσα τον κύριο Βίκτορα Ελιέζερ, Γενικό Γραμματέα του Κεντρικού Ισραηλιτικού Συμβουλίου, να έρθει για να κάνει τις πρώτες απονομές μαζί με τον κύριο Ντάνι Μπερναρντούτ, Γενικό Ταμεία του Κεντρικού Ισραηλιτικού Συμβουλίου. Μπορούμε να συνδεθούμε με το Μουσικό Σχολείο Αθήνας, που φέτος διακρίθηκε με 2 συμμετοχές. Τα παιδιά είναι διαδικτυακά γιατί δεν κατάφεραν να έρθουν εδώ. Η πρώτη ομάδα είναι Και θα παρακαλούσα το Γενικό Γραμματέα Θρησκευμάτων να παραλάβει τα βραβεία των παιδιών, καθώς δεν μπορούν να παρευρίσκονται κοντά μας. Η πρώτη ομάδα είναι το βίντεο «Ένα αστέρι μια φορά», με επιβλέψα την κυρία Μαλιγιάννη Ιουστίνη, για τους μαθητές Σάλα Νικολέτα Παρασκευή, Σαμπατάκου Κωνσταντίνο, Κολύρη Αφέ Αθηνά.
Γεια σας. Γεια σας.
Και το δεύτερο βραβείο είναι το Ανθρώπων Ίχνη, με επιβλέποντα καθηγητή τον κύριο Λιμπερτά Νίκο, για τη Μητράκου Τραμπούλη Ιωάννα Θανασία, Τσακασιάνου Μαρία Σοφία, Τζεβελέκη Ηλέκτρα.
Γεια σας. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Από εδώ, από την Καλαμάτα, θέλω να πω ότι 1,5 εκατομμύριο παιδιά θανατώθηκαν στα στρατόπεδα συγκέντρωσης ανάμεσα στα 6 εκατομμύρια Εβραίους. Και κουβαλάμε μέσα μας αυτό το φορτίο γεμάτο λήψη, αλλά ταυτόχρονα και αισιοδοξία. Ξέρετε, πριν από 50 χρόνια, στα 50 χρόνια από την απελευθέρωση του Auschwitz, το BBC πρότεινε τον Ραβίνο Τζόναθαν Σάξ να ετοιμάσει ένα βίντεο για το Ολοκαύτωμα. Ο Ραβίνος τους είπε λοιπόν, θα το κάνω, αλλά θα τον κάνω με τον εβραϊκό τρόπο. Τον ρώτησαν, ποιος είναι ο εβραϊκός τρόπος? Η απάντηση ήταν, 25 λεπτά θα αναφέρετε το βίντεο αυτό και θα δείχνει το τι συνέβη στα στρατόπεδα. Στα 5 τελευταία λεπτά όμως, θα δείχνουμε παιδιά να παίζουν σε ένα εβραϊκό σχολείο. Θα δείχνουμε ότι η Ιερουσαλήμ ανακτίζεται. Αυτό ο Ραβίνος Σάξ το έκανε διότι ο Σεβασμιότατος θα το γνωρίζει. Την εβραϊκή γιορτή του Πάσχα, το βράδυ που διηγούμαστε την έξοδο των Εβραίων από την Αίγυπτο, τρώμε τα πικρά χόρτα και το άζι. Η βραδιά όμως τελειώνει με 4 ποτήρια κρασί, χαρούμενοι. Είμαστε για την ελευθερία. Τα παιδιά αυτά και όλοι όσοι συμμετέχουν στο διαγωνισμό αυτό μας δείχνουν ότι απέναντι σε αυτούς που επιλέγουν τον θάνατο, εμείς επιλέγουμε την αξία της ζωής. Και γι' αυτό σας αξίζουν θερμά συγχαρητήρια.
Δεν ξέρω αν τα παιδιά θέλουν να πούνε κάτι.
Ωραία. Ήταν μια υπέροχη εμπειρία, νομίζω, για όλους.
Δεν σας ακούμε. Θα πρέπει να βγάλεις... Θα πρέπει να πας πιο κοντά.
Ωραία. Έχω να πω ότι νομίζω για όλους εδώ ήταν μια πολύ ξεχωριστή εμπειρία και πολύ ιδιαίτερη και θα τη θυμόμαστε νομίζω αρκετό καιρό. Ήταν πάρα πολύ ωραίο το να βλέπεις πώς δημιουργούνται οι ταινίες και να το βιώνει κάποιος.
Και ότι μάθαμε τόσα πολλά για το Ολοκαύτωμα και όλα αυτά καθ' σε όλη τη διαδικασία αυτή, γιατί δεν γνωρίζαμε πολλά. Ναι, οπότε ήταν πολύ ενδιαφέρον να μάθουμε για κάτι τόσο σημαντικό.
Είχε ενδιαφέρον και στο κομμάτι της εκτέλεσης και στο κομμάτι του ότι μάθαμε πράγματα τα οποία δεν θα είχαμε σε καμία περίπτωση την ευκαιρία να μάθουμε διαφορετικά.
Παιδιά, ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Θα συνδεθούμε τώρα με το 1ο Λύκειο Αθηνών. Και θα ζητήσω από τον κύριο Σάμι Ναμία, την Εβραϊκή Νεολαία Ελλάδος, να έρθει να δώσει το άλλο βραβείο. Το ένατο Λύκειο Αθηνών με την ταινία 7 ακόμα και επιβλέψω καθηγήτρια την κυρία Μπαλοπούλου Μαριγούλα, με μαθητές στο Στάθη Δημήτριο Χαράλαμπο και την Ασκερή Στέλλα, παίρνουν το επόμενο βραβείο. Το παραλαμβάνει από το... Θέλετε, παιδιά, να μας πείτε κάτι?
Ναι. Εκτός, θέλει να μιλήσει πρώτα η Ιωάννα. Δεν την ακούω. Εγώ θα πω πως... Θα ήθελα αρχικά να ευχαριστήσω την καθηγήτριά μας, την κυρία Μπαλοπούλου, η οποία μας πρότεινε να συμμετέχουμε στο συγκεκριμένο πρόγραμμα και μας έδωσε την εν λόγω ευκαιρία. Και αντιστοίχως τις συμμαθήτριές μου Ιωάννα Δερμιτζάκη και Στέλλα Ασκερή, αν και η Στέλλα δεν μπορούσε να συμμετέχει σήμερα λόγω COVID. Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω επίσης τη Αργυρό Γραβάνη και Ευαγγελία Τάσιου για την ανιδιοτελή συμμετοχή τους και ενίσχυση στη δημιουργία του βίντεο και project, όπως και το Εβραϊκό Μουσείο για την πραγματοποίηση του όλου προγράμματος. Η ευκαιρία για εμάς ήταν μοναδική, διότι η συμμετοχή μας σε αυτό το πρόγραμμα μας έχει παρέχει και εμάς γνώσεις, όχι μόνο στη θεωρία, αλλά και στην πράξη, και η εμπλοκή μας στα ιστορικά αυτά γεγονότα μας έχει ευαισθητοποιήσει περαιτέρω. Είμαστε ευγνώμονες. Σας ευχαριστώ θερμά.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, παιδιά.
Εμείς.
Το επόμενο Λύκειο είναι εδώ μαζί μας και είναι το Καλλιτεχνικό Σχολείο Γέρακα. Θα έρθετε? Και μαθητές Γκούμας Αντώνιο. Η κυρία Λυράκη Χρυσή είναι επιβλέπους εκπαιδευτικός και οι μαθητές Γκούμας Αντώνιος και η Βαλιώτη Σαβέλα. Κυρία Λυράκη, ωραία.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για την ευκαιρία που μας δίνει τόσο το Υπουργείο όσο και το Εβραϊκό Μουσείο Ελλάδας για να ξανασκεφτούμε την ιστορία και να έτσι κοιτάξουμε το παρελθόν για να γίνει το μέλλον καλύτερο. Και ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ τους μαθητές μας, γιατί όπως είπε σοφά η κυρία πιο πριν, αντί τα παιδιά να παίζουν ηλεκτρονικά παιχνίδια ή να τσατάρουν με τους συμμαθητές τους κτλ., σκέφτονται και αισθάνονται και δημιουργούν. Και σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Ευχαριστούμε όλους πάρα πολύ. Θα παρακαλούσα το Σεβασμιότατο Μητροπολίτη Μεσσηνίας και τον κύριο Μάτσα, πρόεδρο του Εβραϊκού Μουσείου, να ανέβουν να δώσουν το τελευταίο βραβείο, που φέτος θα το πάρει ένα λύκειο από την Κρήτη και τα παιδιά ταξίδεψαν από την Κρήτη εδώ, για να είναι εδώ μαζί μας. Είναι το Γέλ Αγίου Μύρονα. Θα παρακαλούσα τα παιδιά να ανέβουν. Το Γέλ Αγίου Μύρονα φέτος πήρε 2 διακρίσεις. Η μία διάκριση είναι ένα από τα 5 βραβεία του διαγωνισμού που θα λάβει μέρος στο εκπαιδευτικό πρόγραμμα που περιλαμβάνει το εκπαιδευτικό ταξίδι στο Auschwitz. Το δεύτερο βραβείο που πήρε είναι μετά από πρωτοβουλία της κυρίας Άννα Μισέλα Σιμακοπούλου ως πρόεδρο του Transatlantic Friends of Israel και θα ταξιδέψουν στις Βρυξέλλες να επισκεφτούν την Ευρωβουλή, να γνωρίσουν από κοντά τους θεσμούς και να παρουσιάσουν το έργο τους. Η κυρία Μπενέκου Ελένη, επιβλέπουσα καθηγήτρια, ο Πιπεράκης Άγγελος, Διαμαντάκης Νικόλαος και Γιαννακάκης Κωνσταντίνος. Δεν θα δούμε. Κύριε Μάτσα, ως εμπνευστής μαζί με τον Γενικό Γραμματέα αυτής της ιδέας, θα θέλετε να μας πείτε...
Είναι γεγονός ότι το πρόγραμμα της εκπαίδευσης των μαθητών και της επίσκεψης στο Auschwitz είναι ένα από τα σημαντικότερα, ίσως κατ' εμέ, ίσως το σημαντικότερο πρόγραμμα εκπαίδευσης που έχουμε. Βεβαίως υπάρχει η εκπαίδευση των καθηγητών, υπάρχει ο είδους εκπαίδευσης, αλλά αυτό θεωρώ ότι είναι ίσως το σημαντικότερο. Η νέα γενιά θέλει και να οδηγεί τους υπόλοιπους νέους στην εκπαίδευση και στην εκμάθηση αυτού του φοβερού περιστατικού, αυτού του φοβερού ολοκαυτώματος που έγινε πριν από τόσα χρόνια. Βέβαια, όλα αυτά δεν θα γινόντουσαν εάν δεν είχα το μουσείο, αν δεν είχε την στενότατη συνεργασία με το Υπουργείο Παιδείας και Θρησκευμάτων και ιδιαίτερα με τον Γενικό Γραμματέα του κύριο Καλατζή και την κυρία Κεραμίδα από εδώ, οι οποίοι ενδιαφέρονται σαν να είναι ένα παιδί τους, ενδιαφέρονται για να θριαμβεύσει αυτό το πρόγραμμα και για να μεγαλουργήσει. Και θα ήθελα να τους ευχαριστήσω και προσωπικά. Πολύ.
Θέλετε και εσείς να μοιραστείτε κάτι μαζί μας? Θα θέλετε να μοιραστείτε κάτι?
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για την τιμή της βράβευσης. Είναι πολύ όμορφο συναίσθημα. Δημιουργήθηκε μια ταινία μικρού μήκους, «Θάλασσα μνήμη», με πολύ αγάπη. Ήταν μια πρωτόγνωρη και συναρπαστική εμπειρία. Προερχόμαστε από ένα μικρό χωριό, ορεινό, του Ηρακλείου Κρήτης, τον Άγιο Μύρονα, που υπέφερε πολλά χρόνια από τον πόλεμο. Το ναυάγιο Τάναης κατηφορίζαμε όλοι μαζί την οδό Πλάνης. Μικρά παιδιά, άρρωστοι, γέροι, γυναίκες και άνδρες. Μας θεωρούσαν επικίνδυνους. Όμως ήμασταν πληγωμένα θηρία, τρομαγμένα, αιχμάλωτοι πολέμου, Ελληνοεβραίοι, κριτικοί αντιστασιακοί και Ιταλοί στρατιώτες. Μας πέταξαν σαν σακιά στο φορτηγό πλοίο Τάναης. Είχε γερμανική σημαία. Κλείδωσαν τα λουκέτα. Πήγαμε τυλιγμένοι στο μπαμπάκι, από τη χώρα με τον παντοτινό ήλιο. Προορισμός μας, η χώρα της Βάστιγκας, τα στρατόπεδα συγκέντρωσης στο Auschwitz της Πολωνίας, εκεί που γδέρνουν την ανθρωπιά ως το κόκαλο. Η μνήμη μου με προδίδει. Ποιος ήμουν? Ο Αβραάμ? Η Ραχίλα από τα Χανιά? Ο Στέλιος από το Σμάρι? Ο Λουίτζι από τη Φλωρεντία? Ήμουν στο τέταρτο, στο τελευταίο αμπάρι. Δεν είχε φως. Μια χαλασμένη λάμπα. Ολόγυρα κάγκελα. Λευκά κελιά, υγρά κελιά. Σε ένα τέτοιο κελί, στην ελληνική μυθολογία, ο βασιλιάς Ακρίσιος είχε κλειδώσει και ρίξει στη θάλασσα την κόρη του Δανάη και το μικρό Περσέα από φόβο. Μη χάσει τη ζωή του από τον εγγονό του με βάση ένα χρησμό που είχε λάβει. Δάναης, Δαναής, Δανάη. Ο μύθος επαναλαμβάνεται. Ο χρόνος, η σιωπή, τα παιδικά χρόνια, οι γονείς στην αυλή, οι φίλοι στις αλάνες, τα γλέντια, η Σμαρώ, το πρώτο φιλί. Άλλοι τώρα κινούσαν τα πιόνια στη ζωή μας. Η ανελευθερία, ο φόβος, ο ναζισμός, ο φασισμός, ο θάνατος. Υπάρχει έξοδος. Βράδυ 8ης προς 9η Ιουνίου 1944, μεταξύ Ντίας και Σαντορίνης. Οι υπότες, οι βασιλείς, οι στρατιώτες και τα άλογα, κόκκινα. Η Πανσέλινος αιμορραγεί. Τα κλειδιά δεν βρέθηκαν ποτέ. Σου μιλώ από βάθος 1858 μέτρα. Με ακούς? Είμαι εδώ. Είμαστε πολλοί. 500 ψυχές. Χιλιάδες ψυχές. Είμαι εδώ. Να σου θυμίζω.
Είμαι ο Αιλάν Κουρντή, 3 χρονών από τη Συρία. Το κύμα με εξέβρασε στις ακτές του Αιγαίου. Να θυμάσαι ότι ονειρεύτηκα την ειρήνη.
Σταυρωτάκια, στραυρωτάκια, στραφτεί ο ουρανός. Και σχέ το απάνω κόσμος, και σχέ το απάνω κόσμος, κι ο κάτω, κι ο κάτω κόσμος άνοιξε. Και τρίζουν τα θεμέλια, και τρίζουν τα θεμέλια. Κι πλάκα, κι πλάκα τον ανατριχιά.